What if the first stories of humanity were never meant to be myths? What if the clay tablets buried beneath the dust of Mesopotamia were not symbols, but records, accounts of those who walked the earth before us, wrote the sky in cuneiform, and vanished without leaving a name? In the low light of dawn between the Tigris and Euphrates, archaeologists found lines pressed into ancient mud. Names older than kings, floods older than Genesis, calendars that seemed to begin before time itself. Yet somewhere along the way, the thread was cut. The tablets were scattered, broken, mistranslated, locked away in museum basements, or lost to wars and sandstorms. And now, we are left with fragments, stories that whisper of gods who ruled like men, and men who lived like gods. Take a breath. Let the silence settle. Because tonight, we follow those fragments, back to the beginning, where the first language tried to remember what the world had already forgotten. And take a moment to like this video and subscribe, only if you truly enjoy stories that drift between dream and history. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is. There is a quiet that clings to the ruins of Ur, as if the air itself remembers the weight of words once pressed into clay. In that silence, under the pale heat of the southern Mesopotamian plain, a few shards still speak. Lines carved by hands that believed the act of writing could hold the cosmos together. They called themselves the Sagiga, the black-headed people, and they claimed they were taught the arts of civilization by beings who descended from the stars, from the sea, or perhaps from memory itself. The scribes wrote their names, Anu, Enki, Enlil, in symbols older than scripture, but newer than the sky they tried to describe. For more than a century, archaeologists have brushed dust from these fragments, trying to rebuild the oldest story ever told. The problem is not the absence of data, but its abundance. Thousands of tablets, scattered across museums in London, Berlin, Istanbul, New York. Many remain untranslated, some misclassified, others quietly withheld. When they are read aloud, the lines echo familiar rhythms: a flood that ends an age, a man chosen to survive, a serpent that grants forbidden knowledge, a tree that divides life from death. But the Sumerians wrote these tales 2,000 years before the Hebrew texts we call Genesis. So where did the story begin? In the desert, or on the delta where the rivers meet? The Sumerian king list offers one of the strangest clues. Found on a clay prism now in the Ashmolean Museum, it lists rulers and reigns that defy all logic. Some kings are said to have ruled for 28,000 years, others for 36,000. The tablet ends with a single line, then the flood swept over. After that, the reigns become shorter, human. The question that has haunted historians ever since. Were these exaggerated symbols of power, or traces of something the modern mind can no longer grasp? Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the greatest Sumerologists of the 20th century, once said that Sumerian civilization seemed to appear suddenly and fully formed, without visible antecedents. There are older settlements, yes, Eridu, Lagash, Kish, but none explain the leap from village life to city-states, complete with writing, law codes, ziggurats aligned with the stars, and mathematical systems that calculated lunar cycles with uncanny precision. Civilization did not evolve slowly here. It appeared as if delivered. Among the earliest tablets ever found are administrative records, lists of grain, trade routes, temple offerings, but occasionally a scribe slipped something different between the lines: hymns to the gods who descended, instructions on how to build a bond between heaven and earth, blueprints of something like a cosmic order. The word Temen Anki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, appears again and again. Later the Babylonians would call it Babel. When the ruins of Babylon were first excavated in the 19th century, explorers expected myth to dissolve into dust. Instead, they found foundations of a stepped tower, a ziggurat of fired brick, with layers corresponding eerily to the biblical account. The priests of Marduk once believed the top of that tower reached into the dwelling of the gods, not metaphorically, but as part of an astronomical alignment. If this structure was inspired by an older memory, one born in Sumer, could it be that the Tower of Babel was not arrogance, but remembrance, a reconstruction of a connection long lost? In Eridu, considered by the Sumerians to be the first city ever built, archaeologists uncovered 16 layers of temple foundations stacked atop each other. The oldest, buried deepest, dated back more than 7,000 years. In that first layer was found a small altar, surrounded by clay vessels marked with tiny triangular impressions, perhaps the earliest attempts at symbolic language. The temple was dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and creation, the one said to have risen from the abyss to teach humankind how to write, to build, to heal. It was Enki, not a later priest, who was called Lord of the Deep. Those words, the deep, appear across civilizations that never met. The Hebrew Tehom, the Greek Abyssos, the Akkadian Apsu. Could it be a shared echo, a memory carried forward from a time when humanity's boundaries between myth and knowledge were not yet drawn? The Sumerians did not see themselves as inventors. They described their culture as a gift, a reawakening. They said the first tablets were copies of older writings from before the flood. Some researchers dismiss this as theological metaphor. Others, quietly, have begun to ask whether such writings might still exist. Sealed beneath layers of silt, deep in the old floodplains of southern Iraq, where the rivers once met the sea. Satellite imagery of that region has revealed strange geometric outlines beneath the soil, patterns resembling canals, walls, and foundations now invisible to the naked eye. One, near the site of ancient Uruk, forms a perfect rectangle a kilometre wide, divided into sectors by straight lines. The pattern does not fit known Sumerian urban layouts. Some scholars think it could be natural sediment fractures. Others, like Dr. Stephanie Daly of Oxford, have noted its resemblance to archaic ceremonial enclosures described in later Akkadian texts, the place where the gods first measured the earth. If such a place existed, and if it predates the rise of Sumer, then the question becomes uncomfortable. Who were the builders before the Sumerians remembered them? There are fragments, damaged tablets that mention a forgotten age, when kingship descended from heaven to Eridu. The phrase has been dismissed as metaphor for divine authority. But if one reads it as a statement of contact, a descent, it begins to sound eerily literal. The god Enki, who came from the abyss, taught the me, the divine laws of civilization. There were dozens of them, the arts of building, of music, of metallurgy, of justice. Each was a gift from a higher realm. It was not evolution, it was transmission. Archaeologists, of course, prefer another word, diffusion. Cultures borrow, spread, evolve. But diffusion does not explain the sudden precision of Sumerian astronomy, nor why their year began at the spring equinox, with the exact same alignment used by later Babylonian and Egyptian priests. Nor does it explain how their mythology already contained a map of the solar system describing 7 heavenly bodies that move, and an 8th that shines dimly beyond. Coincidence or memory? Each fragment points toward an origin story that history has chosen not to tell, one in which humanity did not rise from ignorance, but awoke after forgetting. As night falls over the silent ruins, you can almost hear the wind moving through the broken bricks, whispering the same question the Sumerians once asked themselves. What did the first people truly know, and who taught them to remember? The ruins of Eridu lie quiet beneath the sand, but the silence hides something older than time. A pulse beneath the clay, a memory buried in salt and silt. When archaeologists first uncovered the sequence of temples there, they expected to find the gradual rise of architecture. Instead, they found a pattern of repetition, as though each generation had tried not to build something new, but to rebuild something remembered. Each layer mirrored the one beneath. The same plan, the same central chamber, the same orientation toward the stars. As if the builders were not inventing but restoring. Among the artifacts found in those earliest layers were fragments of small clay tablets, the precursors of cuneiform, pressed with wedge-shaped marks so faint that only under a bleak light could they be read. One fragment bore the symbol of a fish, intertwined with a human figure, labelled Anis. The name appears again later in Babylonian chronicles, describing a being who emerged from the sea to teach humankind the arts of civilization, then returned to the depths each night. The story of Oannes would later echo through Greek accounts of Berossus, and even through Hebrew texts that speak of watchers who descended to instruct mankind. Different names, same pattern. The story always begins the same way. Knowledge comes from the waters, from the abyss, from below, not from above. The sea, in the ancient world, was not chaos but memory, the place where the first knowledge was stored, where time folded back on itself. When the Sumerians described their gods as emerging from the Abzu, they were not imagining monsters, but recalling something they could not explain. Beings or teachers who came from a world beneath the known one. Modern scholars like Zecharia Sitchin interpreted these myths as accounts of extraterrestrial contact. Others, like Thorkild Jacobson and Kramer, rejected the literal reading but still admitted that Sumerian texts hold an unusual obsession with transmission, the giving and receiving of knowledge across boundaries. The me were not inventions, they were retrieved. The very act of writing was described as a recovery, not a creation. Even the Sumerian word for to know, ed, shares its root with to see again, to remember. In the ruins of Nippur, another fragment was found. The instructions of Shurapak, one of the oldest written moral codes on earth. It speaks of floods, of the limits of human arrogance, of obedience to the gods. But hidden between its lines is a subtler message. Do not transgress the bounds set before the flood. Those bounds were not only moral, the term used, milam, can also mean measure or pattern. It suggests the existence of laws, perhaps physical, perhaps spiritual, that governed the world before the catastrophe. The Sumerians remembered these laws as gifts lost and partially restored. And then there is the flood. The deluge that ends one age and begins another appears in almost every surviving Sumerian tablet. But the earliest version, the Eridu Genesis, is different from the later biblical echo. Here, the gods do not destroy humanity for sin, but for noise. They say the world had become too loud, that the clamour of men disturbed the order of heaven. It was Enki, the Lord of Wisdom, who warned Ziusudra, the chosen man, to build a vessel and preserve the seed of life. The flood came, the cities were erased, and afterward the gods shortened the span of human years. That line has haunted scholars for decades. It appears again in the King list, the sudden shortening of rains after the flood. Some geneticists looking at the abrupt population bottleneck around 12,000 years ago have quietly drawn parallels. Others point to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a cometary event that melted glaciers, flooded coastal plains, and may have wiped out early civilizations along the now submerged shores of the Persian Gulf. If that cataclysm was real, the memory of it would have echoed for millennia, and in that echo the survivors might have tried to rebuild what they remembered, not from invention, but from fragments of an earlier world. The Sumerians called themselves the Re-established. In 2016, a geological survey along the ancient coastline near the Shatt al-Arab revealed something strange. A buried layer of burned clay and carbonized wood, overlain by marine silt, dated roughly to 10,800 BCE, long before Sumer itself. Some dismissed it as evidence of a local flood, but others, like Dr. Farouk El-Baz, suggested it might be the trace of a coastal settlement destroyed when the Gulf flooded in the late Pleistocene. If so, could that have been the origin of the myths? A civilization drowned, remembered only as the land before the waters rose? The Sumerians had a name for it, Dilmun, a paradise where the sun rises, where sickness did not exist, and where gods walked among men. Archaeologists once thought Dilmun was a poetic metaphor for the afterlife, but in the 20th century, excavations on Bahrain, the ancient land of Dilmun, revealed massive burial mounds, seals with inscriptions in proto-cuneiform, and trade links stretching from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley. The merchants of Dilmun carried copper, lapis lazuli, and cedar, but perhaps something else too, the stories of the world before the flood. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero journeys to Dilmun seeking immortality. There he meets Utnapishtim, or the flood survivor, who tells him that the gods had once gathered in secret to decide the fate of men. When Gilgamesh asks how he can find eternal life, Utnapishtim says it is impossible, because the days of the long kings are gone. Again, that same break, that sense of an order lost. Perhaps the truest mystery is not whether the flood occurred, but why the Sumerians believed they were rebuilding, not beginning. Their mathematics was not primitive. It used a base 60 system still unmatched in elegance. Their star charts were not symbolic. They recorded lunar months, planetary conjunctions, and equinox precessions that modern astronomers have verified. These are not the tools of a people discovering civilization. They are the instruments of a culture remembering it. And yet, the more they remembered, the more they feared forgetting. The temples of Nippur and Eridu were not just places of worship, they were archives. The walls themselves were layered with tablets, each generation copying and preserving those before. When the Assyrians conquered Sumer, they took the tablets to Nineveh, where centuries later the library of Ashurbanipal would burn, and with it, much of humanity's first memory. But fragments survive, and even in fragment the whisper continues. We were taught, then we forgot. Each age rebuilds the story, each scholar restores a shard, and the pattern returns, a spiral of rediscovery, loss, and silence. And somewhere under the dunes of Eridu, under the 16th temple in the dust of millennia, there may still lie a deeper foundation, one that has never been unearthed. A chamber whose walls are lined not with prayers, but with instructions. If such a room exists, and if its symbols could still be read, what would they tell us about who we are and who we once were? When British Museum curators first unwrapped the clay fragments from the ruins of Uruk, they expected nothing more than economic lists: barley, sheep, copper ingots. Yet among them was a set of inscriptions unlike any other, tablets written not for counting, but for remembering. The signs were dense, almost lyrical, as though language itself had begun to turn back into poetry. One phrase stood out: the day when the foundations were measured in the sky. For a long time, scholars treated it as metaphor, a poetic flourish. But when astronomers began to map the star alignments of ancient Sumerian cities, the metaphor began to look suspiciously exact. Uruk's main temple, the Yana precinct, aligns with the rising of Sirius at midsummer. Nippur faces the belt of Orion during the winter solstice. Eridu, the oldest of them all, aligns almost perfectly with Canopus, a southern star barely visible from Mesopotamia's latitude. The question is not whether they noticed these stars, but why they aligned entire cities to them. What were they measuring? In the mid-20th century, a quiet controversy began among archaeologists. Henri Frankfort noted that Sumerian temples seemed to form part of a larger unseen geometry, as if each sacred site was one node in a constellation laid out upon the ground. When mapped, they followed ratios and angles that mirrored celestial coordinates. This pattern could have been coincidence, but it repeated through generations, even as rulers changed and dynasties fell. The ground mirrored the heavens. To the Sumerians, this was not symbolism. It was necessity. They believed civilization existed only when the earth and sky were in resonance, when the measures of heaven were reflected in the foundations of the world. The temple, or ziggurat, was literally a ladder of frequencies: clay for the earth, bitumen for the deep, bronze for the air, gold for the sun. Each layer corresponded to a realm. It was not a monument of worship, but a tuning instrument, an attempt to restore harmony between humankind and the cosmos. Modern science tends to divide what the ancients fused, but traces of this older synthesis remain. In 1939, an excavation near Ur uncovered a set of small fired discs, etched with concentric rings and radial lines. For decades, no one knew what they were. Some thought they were gaming pieces, others suspected astronomical charts. In 2018, a reanalysis by Dr. Wayne Horowitz and the British Museum team found the spacing of those rings corresponded precisely to the orbital ratios of Mercury, Venus and Earth, accurate within 1%. How could a people of 3000 BCE know that? There is a quiet possibility that the Sumerians did not discover the sky. They inherited its map. Their word for knowledge, Nisaba, also the name of their goddess of writing, meant not only to know but to inscribe the heavens upon the earth. The oldest calendars were not agricultural, but stellar. Even their creation hymn, Enuma Elish, begins with a cosmological formula describing the ordering of waters and the separation of heaven from the abyss, a poetic echo of what physicists now call entropy and structure. What is striking is the precision of their timekeeping. Using a sexagesimal base 60 system, they divided the circle into 360 degrees and the hour into 60 minutes, a measure still used today. Their months followed lunar cycles of 29,503 to 59 days, nearly identical to modern astronomical values. Yet the instruments they used, sighting rods, shadow gnomons, polished stones, should not have allowed such accuracy, unless they were refining data from an earlier forgotten source. In one tablet found at Sippar, the scribe writes, "The watchers of the stars measure not for kings, but for remembrance." It is an odd phrase. Remembrance of what? The myth of the Watchers appears again later in Hebrew texts. The Book of Enoch describes them as beings who taught men the courses of the sun and the moon. Scholars have long debated whether these were symbolic angels or distorted memories of early astronomers. But the Sumerian root word, igigi, means those who observe. The igigi were said to have once worked in the heavens, measuring time for the gods, until they grew weary and descended to earth. After that descent, the age of men began. There is another tablet, broken, half erased, found at Kish in 1902. It speaks of the 7 sages, the Apkallu, sent by the god Enki to restore order after a flood. Each sage taught a different art: agriculture, geometry, writing, metallurgy, healing, and the measurement of the deep. The last sage, Utuabzu, returned to the sea. The term Abzu, again, the abyss, the same place where the god Enki dwelled, where knowledge was said to sleep. Some historians believe the Apkallu were allegories for early city founders. But in Mesopotamian art, they are often depicted as bearded men with the bodies or cloaks of fish, holding small bags and pinecone-like objects, tools whose purpose remains mysterious. These images are carved not just in Sumer, but later in Assyria, Babylon, even on the gate reliefs of Persepolis centuries later. The motif endured because it symbolized something foundational, the passing down of a system, perhaps an encoded science wrapped in myth. When the first cuneiform texts were decoded in the 19th century, the translators often filtered them through the lens of religion. Anything that spoke of the stars or of beings descending from heaven was reinterpreted as divine allegory. Yet when astrophysicists revisited these same texts in the 20th century, they found a startling consistency. The Sumerians had catalogued Jupiter's moons, recorded the retrograde motions of Mars, and identified the precession of the equinoxes long before the Greeks. These are not inventions of a simple culture. They are signs of observation refined over millennia. So again arises the unspoken question: observation or inheritance? We think of time as linear, progress as ascent. But what if civilization moves in cycles? Creation, collapse, remembrance, rebuilding. Each cycle shorter, each memory fainter. The Sumerians may have been the first to write, but what they wrote of was not a beginning, it was a return. In 2019, during a re-examination of a Sumerian tablet long stored in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, high-resolution imaging revealed an inscription previously invisible. A notation system consistent with trigonometric calculation. The angles written in base 60 describe a right triangle, centuries before Pythagoras. The text ends with a phrase, "These are the measures of the flood." The scholar Eleanor Robson noted that the term flood here could mean boundary, perhaps a metaphor for the horizon, the curve of the world, the mathematics of the sea's edge. Every fragment leads back to that boundary, between earth and water, between memory and myth. The Sumerians stood at that threshold, looking both backward and forward, trying to anchor their fragile world between 2 eras, the one they remembered and the one they feared would be forgotten. When you read the tablets aloud, their wedge-shaped signs pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, the sound is like rainfall, rhythmic, patient, eternal. It is the sound of memory trying to become matter, and sometimes, in that rhythm, you might wonder, were they writing for us, or for those who would come after another flood? In the low light of a museum storage room in Baghdad, a curator once lifted the lid of a wooden crate and found a tablet she had never seen catalogued before. Its surface was worn, edges chipped, but beneath the dust were the faint traces of cuneiform unlike the others, deeper, almost carved rather than pressed. When infrared imaging was later used, faint symbols emerged, a sequence of star maps, interlaced with lists of numbers written in the base 60 system. The last line translated loosely as, "The path of the gods returns after the Dark Age." No one could agree what it meant. Some said it referred to the cyclic movement of planets, others to a mythological era. But among those who studied Sumerian astronomy, it sounded like a warning, a recognition that even the stars themselves move in patterns of loss and return. If you look at the sky above southern Iraq today, you will see little of what the Sumerians saw. Dust veils the horizon, and light from the cities drowns the constellations. Yet 5,000 years ago, that same sky was a living archive. To them, every motion of light carried meaning. Venus, which they called Inanna, rose and fell in cycles of 8 years, disappearing into the sun's glare, only to be reborn as the evening star. In those cycles they saw not astronomy, but theology, the death and resurrection of the goddess. The Descent of Inanna, one of humanity's oldest surviving poems, tells of the goddess descending into the underworld to face her shadow and return renewed. But beneath its mythic surface lies a striking astronomical code: 7 gates, 7 nights, 7 judgments, mirroring the planet's journey through the sky's 7 visible spheres. The poem is not a dream, it is a record, and in that record lies one of the earliest known correlations between human consciousness and the movements of the cosmos. Each temple of Sumer had an observer's court, an open terrace lined with polished stone where priests tracked the rising of the stars. The line between science and religion did not exist. Observation itself was an act of reverence. The priests of Nippur marked the heliacal rising of Sirius to predict the floods. The priest of Uruk noted the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, recording it as the birth of a new age. They called these alignments Shidu, crossings. Each crossing, they said, reset the measure of time. Among the many Sumerian terms that have no direct translation, one remains haunting: Mi-Shid, the law of crossing. It appeared in ritual hymns, in building inscriptions, even in myths. Some interpret it as a metaphor for balance. Others believe it referred to the cosmic cycles that governed all existence, the turning of the heavens mirrored in the fates of men. In every myth, knowledge of the Mi-Shid was said to be dangerous, reserved for the gods and the 7 sages. In the ruins of Sippar, a strange artifact was once found, a circular tablet inscribed with an astronomical pattern so intricate that, when projected, it resembled the precessional path of the equinoxes. The inscription dated it to around 3200 BCE, yet it depicted alignments that would only occur again 12,000 years later. Was this coincidence, or a survival of data from an earlier epoch? The German scholar Hugo Winkler, studying the artifact in the early 1900s, wrote privately that the Sumerians seemed to have memory of a sky that no longer existed. His note was never published. It was found decades later in his papers, along with a sketch of the same pattern overlaid on a map of Mesopotamia. The alignments matched the axes of major temple sites almost perfectly. The earth, it seemed, was built to remember the heavens. What makes this more mysterious is the recurring symbol of the 8-pointed star. It appeared on cylinder seals, jewellery and temple walls. To most, it represented Inanna. But in some inscriptions, the same symbol is labelled the balance of the world. Astronomers now know that the path of Venus forms an 8-petaled pattern in the sky over 8 years. The Sumerians had captured that geometry millennia before modern plotting tools existed. The deeper one looks, the more the lines blur between myth and map. The Sumerians did not record random omens. They were encoding celestial mechanics through story. Their myths of descent and return, of floods and rebirth, of divine cycles, all reflected the same principle, that time was not linear. It curved, repeated, breathed. And if time curved, memory did too. A few scholars have dared to connect this worldview with the structure of their cities. Excavations at Uruk show concentric city walls expanding outward over centuries, each layer aligned slightly differently with true north, as if each reconstruction corrected for a slow drift, what we now call axial precession. They were tracking the turning of the earth itself. To realize that over generations suggests continuity of knowledge far older than any single dynasty could have maintained. How far back could that continuity stretch? At the bottom of some temple staircases, archaeologists have found stone plaques engraved with glyphs no one can yet decipher, proto-symbols predating cuneiform. They recur in patterns of 7 and 12, the numbers of the planets, the numbers of cycles, The pattern repeats even in faraway cultures, on the Indus seals, in early Egyptian hieroglyphs, in Anatolian shrines. The same numeric symbology, scattered across continents long before recorded contact. Some explain this through coincidence or shared human psychology. Others see something deeper, a shared inheritance from a forgotten source. If that source existed, perhaps the Sumerians were not inventors but archivists, trying to preserve the remnants of a knowledge system erased by catastrophe. Their obsession with alignment, measure, and the stars may have been less about worship, more about calibration, ensuring the world did not fall out of tune. Because to them, imbalance was destruction. The flood was not only water, it was cosmic dissonance. The gods, they said, unleashed chaos when humans forgot the measures. Civilization's task was to restore the harmony of heaven and earth. The tablets do not speak of conquest or empire, but of balance. When the measures are kept, the world endures. Yet every age forgets. The alignments drift, the temples crumble, the sky changes. The Sumerians, perhaps sensing this, built everything to endure the memory. Fired clay could outlast flesh. The word could outlive the speaker. That is why they pressed their history into tablets, not for the living, but for whoever would rebuild after the next deluge. When British forces entered Ur during the First World War, soldiers found broken bricks inscribed with lines of prayer. May these words reach the one who rebuilds. Perhaps they already knew that history repeats. Perhaps they understood that every civilization writes for its successor. If the Sumerians were indeed preserving fragments of a lost science, astronomy, geometry, or a deeper cosmology, then what might still lie buried, untranslated, unseen? In vaults beneath the Tigris silt, hundreds of tablets remain untouched, sealed in bitumen jars. Some were found wrapped in linen, as if meant to survive fire and flood. Somewhere among them might rest another map, one not of earth, but of the sky, as it once was. If it were read, would it confirm what the ancients whispered, that the heavens themselves have fallen out of rhythm, and that each civilization rises only to tune the world again? Or would it reveal something stranger still? That the story of humanity is the story of remembering what was lost over and over under the turning stars? There is a story buried within the ruins of Nippur, a story not of kings or gods, but of the scribes who tried to record everything they could before it vanished. When the city fell to drought and war, they gathered the surviving tablets, those that had not yet been stolen, burned or washed away, and sealed them in clay jars covered with pitch, buried beneath the floors of their temple. When modern excavators unearthed that cache in 889, they found more than 6,000 tablets, some shattered, others intact, many written in a dialect that predated known Sumerian. The scholars who read them realized they were looking at the last desperate attempt of a dying civilization to preserve the memory of the first. Among those tablets was one fragment that seemed out of place. It contained a list, not of kings or temples, but of sounds, vowels, intonations, breathing marks. It was, as far as we know, the first known phonetic record in human history. At the bottom of the tablet, barely legible, a line read, "These are the sounds of the gods." It might have been poetry or a misunderstanding. But when the lines were analysed in the 20th century, linguists found something unsettling. The syllables corresponded to acoustic frequencies that matched resonances of ancient stone chambers, including those found at Eridu and Uruk. Each sound, when chanted, vibrated precisely at harmonic intervals. This was not coincidence. The Sumerians, it seemed, had treated language not only as symbol, but as vibration, a tool for restoring the measures between heaven and earth. If that sounds mystical, consider that their word for temple was e-gol, literally house of resonance, and that the earliest descriptions of rituals in the Kesh temple hymn speak of tones that lifted the foundations of the world. Later translations obscured it as metaphor, but in the original text the verbs are physical. They measured the earth by sound. In 1998, acoustic archaeologist Paul Devereux conducted experiments in several reconstructed Sumerian temple models, using low-frequency resonances to test the shape's vibrational behavior. What he found mirrored modern studies of standing wave phenomena. At certain frequencies, the rooms amplified sound into geometric patterns of dust, forming the same seven-petaled motif carved into Sumerian reliefs. These were not decorative. They were the visible signatures of sound. The ancients, in their own way, were mapping physics through ritual. This realization sheds light on why so many Sumerian myths involve the voice, the command, the spoken word, the chant. The me, those divine laws, were always said to be uttered into existence. Creation was not an act of making, but of resonance. When Enki spoke the measures, the world retuned itself. It's not surprising then that their system of writing evolved from marks of measurement, lines and counts into syllables of sound. Cuneiform was not merely a script, it was a codification of vibration. Each wedge mark had a rhythm, a weight, a tempo. To write was to sing in clay, and the scribes were not authors in our sense. They were conductors of memory. In a sense, their civilization was a giant instrument, designed to keep the world in harmony with the cosmos. The ziggurats, with their layered terraces, acted as resonant towers, each material producing a frequency that corresponded to a celestial body. Clay for the moon, copper for Venus, gold for the sun. The architecture itself sang, though we can no longer hear it. The tablets of Nippur describe something called the ceremony of the measures, performed every 600 years. The text is incomplete, but it mentions recalibrating the temple, realigning its pillars with the heavenly chord, and singing the foundations anew. Astronomers now recognize that roughly every 600 years corresponds to the half-cycle of precessional drift in the Sumerian observational system. They were literally correcting for the slow rotation of the Earth's axis. To think that 5,000 years ago, priests were using sound and starlight to maintain a cosmic alignment makes our own technologies seem strangely pale. But then, the question arises, why did it end? If they held such precise understanding, how did it vanish so completely that only fragments remain? The texts hint at two possibilities. One speaks of corruption, that the measures were altered by those seeking power. The other, darker one, says the resonance itself was broken, that the sky no longer answered. Around 2200 BCE, the climate in Mesopotamia changed abruptly. Drought swept across the Fertile Crescent. The rivers shrank, crops failed, cities were abandoned. Geological cores showed dust layers consistent with a multi-decade collapse of rainfall. The Akkadian Empire fell. The Sumerian cities emptied. To those who survived, it must have felt as though the gods had turned away. But the oldest laments, especially the lament for Ur, do not describe divine anger. They describe silence. The word of Enlil did not return. The heavens no longer spoke to the earth. It was as if the channel had gone dead. The frequencies no longer resonated. Civilization had lost its tone. Some believe this was metaphor for environmental collapse. Others see it as something stranger, a record of a loss not only of stability but of communication itself. The connection between human and cosmic measure had broken. The very idea of sacred order had collapsed, and what followed was a long forgetting. In that forgetting, something shifted in humanity. Writing, once sacred, became administrative. Sound became speech. Temple became state. The resonance turned into hierarchy. What had been knowledge of harmony became law of power. The gods receded. Kings rose. Perhaps that is the true meaning of the fall of Sumer. Not that their gods abandoned them, but that they ceased to listen. When the cities of Ur and Lagash were finally buried under dust, the winds erased the sound of the chants. Only the tablets remained, and even they were scattered, broken, reduced to fragments of a language we still barely understand. But in some quiet places, the echoes persist. The chambers of Eridu, when tested, still hum faintly at 110 Hz, the same frequency found in prehistoric caves and megalithic sites worldwide. Coincidence or remembrance? Maybe what we call civilization is nothing more than a tuning, each culture trying, in its own way, to recover the lost frequency of the world. The Sumerians may have been the first to try, and if those frequencies truly existed, if their temples once vibrated in sympathy with the stars, then perhaps the end of their world was not destruction, but dissonance, the moment when harmony could no longer hold. When you stand among their ruins now and the wind moves through broken corridors, it sounds almost like breath, soft, rhythmic, ancient, a civilization exhaling, waiting for someone someday to find the tone again. When the first British archaeologists opened the mound of Tel Asmar in the 1930s, they expected another temple ruin. What they found instead were rows of small alabaster figures, wide-eyed, hands clasped, each carved with an intensity that felt less like worship and more like witnessing. Their pupils were inlaid with bitumen and shell, unblinking, as though waiting for something to return. The tablets found beside them described them not as idols, but as the watchers of the House of Wisdom. The phrase has haunted scholars ever since. To the Sumerians, sight was a sacred act. The word for to see also meant to understand. The word for eye shared its root with light. These statues, then, were not mere effigies. They were vessels of perception, repositories of vision. Their unblinking eyes were thought to keep the measures of heaven even when men could not. The texts call this the watch of the night. It was said that during the dark half of the year, when the constellations shifted and the stars of the south disappeared below the horizon, the watchers stood in their place, maintaining the alignment between earth and sky through stillness alone. They did not speak, did not move, only remembered. What exactly they were remembering is a question that still unsettles. Among the tablets found at the site was a damaged hymn addressed to Enki. It spoke of the lights that vanished from the sea and the seven who departed to guard the foundations of the world. The line is fragmentary, but the imagery recalls the same Apkallu, the seven sages sent before the flood. In some versions they became stars after death. In others they turned to stone. Perhaps these statues were not representations of gods, but memorials of those who once kept the measures. In that sense, the temples of Sumer were not merely sanctuaries but observatories, and the statues, instruments of memory. This idea finds echo in another site, Tel Obeid. There, figures carved with reptilian features were discovered, long heads, large eyes, scaled patterns etched into stone. The Obeid culture predated classical Sumer by at least a millennium. No writing, no known language. And yet their temples were aligned to the same stars. Their figurines clasped the same hands, their faces tilted upward in the same posture of waiting. It is as though the Sumerians inherited not only the land, but a memory older than words, practice of aligning, watching, holding still until the sky spoke again. Modern archaeologists classify the Ubaid figures as fertility icons, but even within that label lies unease. Their proportions are too deliberate, their symmetry too precise. When studied under photogrammetric analysis, their features align with a repeating ratio, 1:1:6:18, the golden section. The same proportion would later define Greek temples, Gothic cathedrals, even modern art. But here it appears in 5000 BCE, carved by people we call prehistoric. Coincidence, perhaps. But the Sumerians did not believe in coincidence. To them, proportion was sacred, an echo of cosmic order. The very layout of Uruk's ziggurat followed those same ratios. Width to height, stair to terrace, base to summit. They built beauty into their structures not for aesthetics, but to mirror the mathematics of the divine. There are fragments that hint at where this belief began. A group of tablets known as the Instructions of Enmeduranki describes a priest-king taken to the assembly of the gods, where he is shown the tablet of the stars, the oil of anointing, and the rod of measurement. Enmeduranki was said to be from Sippar, the city of the sun god, Shamash. Later scholars would identify him as the prototype for Enoch, the antediluvian sage who walked with God and was taken. Both were said to have been shown the secrets of heaven and instructed to pass them to the next generation. The details are remarkably specific. The text mentions the seven of the gods of heaven and earth, who gave him the power to read omens in oil and water, methods of divination that depend on light reflection, optics, and surface vibration. These were not superstitions, but early forms of observation. They measured not with instruments, but with eyes trained to see pattern where others saw chaos. In 2008, researchers studying a group of tablets from the British Museum noted that several omens describing light on water could be interpreted as optical interference phenomena, the shimmering caused by thin film reflection. The language used by the Sumerians to describe it, the dance of the lights, mirrors modern descriptions of diffraction. They were, in their own way, physicists of the visible. To them, the universe was alive, not metaphorically, but literally resonant and responsive. The gods were not distant deities, but frequencies of perception. Each act of seeing, each sound uttered, each measure taken was a dialogue between human and cosmos. When the connection weakened, chaos entered. When it was restored, peace returned. Civilization then was not a structure, it was a state of resonance. And so, when the droughts came, when the rivers withdrew and the temples fell silent, it was not merely political collapse they feared. It was blindness, the loss of sight itself. The watchers' eyes turned grey with dust, the mirrors darkened, the stars no longer matched the temples, the world had slipped out of tune. In the laments of the late Sumerian period, the poets wrote of the night when the eyes of heaven closed. The line repeats across fragments from Ur, Nippur and Kish, as though describing an event beyond metaphor. Some astronomers have speculated that a regional dust storm or volcanic veil could have obscured the stars for months or even years, creating a sense of cosmic abandonment. Others think it was the slow processional shift, the familiar constellations drifting out of alignment with the ancient ziggurats. The heavens had changed their map. What would it feel like for a people who believed the stars were living memory to wake one night and find them gone? Perhaps that was the true beginning of forgetting. When the Sumerians vanished from history, their language remained buried until the 19th century. The watchers of Tel Asmar lay beneath 6 meters of dust, their eyes still open, their silence unbroken. When the archaeologists' lamps first illuminated them, the light reflected off the inlaid pupils with a strange brilliance, as though still holding starlight. Maybe that is why their eyes are so wide, not from fear, but from memory. They are not looking outward. They are remembering inward, keeping the pattern alive through stillness. In that stillness, perhaps, lies the oldest human act of faith, to hold a vision of order even when the world falls into shadow. And in their unblinking gaze one feels the question that haunted them across millennia. When the stars vanish, who will keep the watch? Somewhere in the archives of the British Museum lies a tablet known as KC 38. Unremarkable at first glance, its surface rough and irregular, the script faded by time. Yet its contents have confounded translators for more than a century. It begins with an invocation to the god Enlil, as many do, but then shifts into something altogether different, a sequence of measurements, angles and distances, followed by a sentence almost nonsensical in its modern translation. The sky was measured from beneath. For decades, scholars assumed it was a poetic inversion. Only recently did researchers notice that the numbers carved onto the tablet correspond to the angular relationships of constellations as seen not from the surface, but from the southern hemisphere, an impossibility for the Sumerians, whose world was confined to the northern sky. The implication was disturbing. Either the text was symbolic, or it recorded an inherited knowledge from an age when the map of heaven itself was known differently. The discovery reopened an old question. Could the Sumerians have preserved fragments of a prehistoric science, one passed through catastrophe, encoded in myth, reinterpreted as theology? If so, the records might not only describe what they saw, but what they remembered others seeing before them. When Zecharia Sitchin and other fringe theorists in the late 20th century claimed the Sumerians knew of a 12th planet, most archaeologists dismissed it as fantasy. Yet the root of that idea lies not in fiction, but in a genuine anomaly. The Sumerians identified 11 celestial bodies, Sun, Moon, and the visible planets out to Saturn, plus 2 beyond. The outer wanderers, sometimes depicted as faint or hidden lights. One tablet refers to Nibiru, the crossing, associated with Marduk, the wandering star that appears only once in many generations. Whether Nibiru was a real astronomical body or a symbol of cyclical return remains unknown, but its recurrence through millennia of texts suggests more than allegory. To the Sumerians, Nibiru represented renewal, the realignment of heaven and earth after great dissonance. When Nibiru rises, the texts say, the measures are set right again. It was less a planet than a principle, the return of equilibrium after collapse. This pattern of collapse and restoration runs through their entire mythology. Enlil brings the flood, Enki preserves knowledge, kingship descends, then withdraws. Cities rise, burn, and are rebuilt. It is a cosmology of recurrence, not progress, an understanding of time as spiral rather than line. Modern science has its own spirals. The precession of Earth's axis completes a full cycle roughly every 25,920 years. Over that period, the pole star changes, the constellations shift, and the heavens appear to rotate backward through the zodiac. To most ancient civilizations, this slow movement was imperceptible, yet evidence suggests the Sumerians tracked it. The alignments of their temples shift slightly across centuries, compensating for this drift. They were not merely watching the stars, they were calibrating themselves against the motion of time itself. This is where the myths of the Long Kings take on a strange light. The early rulers, said to have reigned tens of thousands of years, may not have been men at all, but symbolic markers of precessional ages. Each reign could have represented a segment of the great cosmic year. When the flood swept over, it may have marked the transition from one age to the next, from the lion to the bull, from Leo to Taurus, around the time agriculture first appeared. If so, the king list is not a chronicle, but a clock. Archaeologist Giorgio Bucciolati once wrote that Sumerian history is written not on a timeline, but on a curve. Each city, each god, each myth corresponds to a point on that curve, the eternal return of alignment between heaven and earth. The more one studies their records, the clearer it becomes. The Sumerians were not merely chroniclers of human events, but cartographers of time. In this light, the flood becomes more than a story of destruction. It becomes a record of a cosmic reset, perhaps even an encoded memory of a geological or astronomical catastrophe that ended an earlier world. The sediments beneath Ur and Shuruppak, with their thick layers of flood-deposited clay, are not myth. They are evidence of a real event dated around 2900 BCE. But to the Sumerians, that flood was also metaphysical, the moment the universe went out of tune and knowledge was washed away. When the waters receded, they began again. They rebuilt their temples, copied their tablets, recalibrated their measures. Civilization rose not from invention, but from remembrance. And yet, even within that rebirth, there were signs of unease. Some late tablets speak of a shadow that moved across the sun, and a fire that came from the north. Astronomers interpret these as solar eclipses or meteor events, but the texts linger on something subtler, a fear of the sky's unpredictability. They describe stars wandering out of their course, constellations that no longer answer. The harmony between heaven and earth had grown unstable. Perhaps they sensed the fragility of their balance, that civilization itself was a temporary tuning, sustained only as long as the heavens remained constant. It is strange to realize how similar that fear feels now. We too watch the skies, measure cycles, chart disruptions in climate and light, fearing collapse while pretending to understand it. The instruments have changed, but the anxiety is the same. We, like them, are watchers, uncertain whether what we see is the end of one age or the beginning of another. And perhaps that is what their texts were always meant to remind us, that the rise and fall of civilizations are not anomalies but rhythms. The flood comes, the memory fades, the measures drift, and yet, from the silt, another hand presses another wedge into another tablet, beginning again. In 2019, archaeologists working near Assyria unearthed a tablet sealed within a jar, its inscription still sharp after 5,000 years. It contained a simple invocation. May whoever finds this remember that we remembered. It is difficult to read that without feeling a kind of quiet kinship, as though across the gulf of millennia, one scribe was whispering to another. What then is history if not the long echo of that whisper? Maybe the story of Sumer is not about beginnings at all, but about continuity, the stubborn persistence of memory against the erasures of time. And if those tablets truly hold fragments of knowledge from before the flood, then their greatest lesson is not technological or astronomical, but existential. That humanity's task has always been to remember how to remember. Even now, as satellites trace the heavens and digital archives store our words, we are still doing what they did, pressing our symbols into another medium, hoping they will survive the next silence. Somewhere, beneath layers of dust and centuries, the ancient scribes might still be listening, and perhaps, when the world grows quiet again, we will hear their answer in the same rhythm of clay, the pulse of memory beneath the turning stars. When the German archaeologist Julius Jordan first mapped the ruins of Uruk in 1912, he noticed something that didn't fit. Beneath the Great Ziggurat, aligned with the ancient processional way, lay a series of sealed chambers cut into the bedrock, empty, undecorated, geometrically perfect. They weren't tombs or storehouses, but voids. Each one measured precisely the same, 4 by 7 cubits, oriented to magnetic north, forming a grid that extended beyond the visible ruins. Later ground surveys found traces of these same subterranean patterns beneath other Sumerian cities. No one could explain their purpose. The chambers contained no offerings, no bones, no markings beyond the faint impressions of tools, and yet their placement was exact, as if they were part of a system invisible above ground. Some speculated they were foundations for larger structures. Others, quietly, suggested something else. Perhaps they were not meant to hold, but to remember. When the first resonance studies were conducted at Uruk in the 1990s, the buried voids produced a peculiar response. Sound waves sent into the ground returned with irregular delays, as though the chambers were tuned to specific frequencies. At 110 Hz, the same pitch discovered in Eridu's ruins, the echo aligned perfectly. Each chamber amplified that tone, creating standing waves beneath the city. The resonance was so strong that the researchers could detect it from the surface. Why would an ancient civilization carve perfect resonant cavities under their temples? Perhaps the answer lies not in architecture but in belief. The Sumerians saw the earth itself as alive, a vessel of vibration. Their myths speak often of the deep that hears. When they performed rituals, they were not asking the gods to descend. They were calling the earth to respond. The ziggurat above and the chambers below formed a dialogue. Heaven above, abyss beneath, humanity in between. This triad appears again and again across their cosmology. An, heaven, ki, earth, absu, the deep. The city itself was the center of that triad, the place where resonance could be restored. To build a temple was to tune the world. In one damaged tablet from the priest writes, "We opened the deep and the voice returned." The line had long been read as metaphor, but if the chambers beneath the city acted as resonant amplifiers, the statement might have been literal. The voice that returned could have been the hum of the earth, the sound of pressure waves reverberating through stone and water. In such a worldview, the planet was not inert but responsive, a participant in ritual, an instrument within the cosmic orchestra. This concept of Earth's voice was not unique to Sumer. Across the world, ancient structures share the same frequency signatures. The 110 Hz resonance found in the Hypogeum of Malta, in Newgrange in Ireland, in the Egyptian king's chamber. Each was built with proportions that generate that same low frequency, one that modern neuroscience associates with altered states of consciousness. The builders may have understood, instinctively or empirically, that sound could bridge worlds. In the Sumerian hymns, the word for wisdom, nisaba, literally meant the vibration that knows. Writing, they said, was born from this vibration, an echo made visible. The scribe did not invent. He transcribed the sound of truth into clay. If this is so, then perhaps those silent chambers beneath Uruk were not empty at all. Perhaps they were the city's memory, a literal resonant archive storing the harmonic signature of the civilization that built them. Every ritual, every chant, every sound might have been absorbed, reverberating endlessly in the stone. In recent years, seismologists have discovered that certain cavities and geological formations do indeed preserve resonant frequencies for centuries, even millennia, like natural recorders of sound waves. To imagine the Sumerians understanding this, intuitively or empirically, is to see how deeply they linked matter, sound, and spirit. They built for the ear of eternity. Yet even such a system could decay. Earth shifts, water seeps, frequencies drift. Over centuries, as floods eroded the plains and earthquakes shifted foundations, the harmony of the cities must have slowly dissolved. Perhaps the priests noticed first. The chants that once caused the walls to hum now met only silence. The measures had drifted again. The earth was out of tune. In the last centuries of Sumer, the texts grow darker. The songs become laments. In one late fragment from Lhasa, a scribe writes, "We sang, and the ground did not answer." Another reads, "The foundations were cut from the deep. The song returned as echo only." It is as though they felt their civilization fading not through conquest, but through dissonance, the slow loss of harmony between world and word. When Ur finally fell, its temples stripped and its archives scattered, the resonant chambers beneath the ziggurat filled with sand and silence. Over millennia they became mere anomalies, geometric puzzles to modern archaeologists, but perhaps, in their own way, they succeeded. Perhaps even now, beneath the shifting dunes, the earth still hums faintly with the memory of the first voices that called to it. For what is memory, if not a vibration that refuses to die? It is strange to think that the sound of an ancient hymn might still linger, inaudible, imperceptible, yet present, buried in the resonance of stone. Scientists have recently captured faint acoustic imprints from ancient pottery, vibrations etched into the grooves by the potter's hand as it turned. When amplified, they produce ghostly echoes, human voices long forgotten. If such traces can remain in clay, why not in the foundations of cities? Maybe the earth itself is the oldest archive, and every civilization leaves its frequency buried beneath the soil. When you walk among the ruins of Uruk at dusk, the air still feels charged, as if waiting for a note that has not yet been struck. The wind moves through the broken bricks with a soft, almost musical rhythm. You can almost imagine it. The echo of a tone once meant to align heaven and earth, now reduced to a whisper carried by the desert air. And in that whisper, something ancient persists. Not a voice, but the possibility of one. A reminder that long before we measured history with time, the ancients measured it with sound. Perhaps in some forgotten chamber beneath the sand, the world is still waiting for someone to listen. At the far edge of the desert near Nasiriyah, a few kilometers from the buried ruins of Eridu, a team of Iraqi archaeologists once uncovered something that would never make the news. It was not gold or idols or monumental architecture, but a set of thin clay tablets sealed within a cylindrical jar, wrapped in what remained of woven reed fibers. The jar had survived because it had been buried beneath a collapsed wall, untouched by air or light for nearly 5,000 years. When they were examined under the laboratory light, the tablets revealed not words, but etchings, spirals, interlocking circles, and a pattern that resembled an astronomical diagram. In its centre, a single inscription could still be read: "The memory of the deep." The phrase appeared before, scattered through Sumerian literature, but always shrouded in metaphor. Here, for the first time, it seemed literal, an object meant to preserve something of the world before. The spirals were not decoration. When transcribed, they matched orbital paths of the planets, Mercury through Saturn, rotated 90 degrees from the known Sumerian system. Whoever had carved it was recording a sky that no longer existed. Scientists call this impossible, yet the Sumerians themselves claimed that their knowledge of the heavens came from the Apsu, the deep, a term used not only for water, but for the hidden strata of the world. To them, the deep was not below, but within. It was the memory of Earth itself, the place where knowledge slept. Some of the oldest myths describe Enki, the god of wisdom, building his home within that abyss. In the Enkian the World Order, the text describes his dwelling as the temple that holds the plans of the earth. Modern translators render it as myth, but the phrasing is oddly technical: plans, measurements, foundations. Enki's house, the Iabzu, was less a palace than an archive, a vault of knowledge older than the flood, older than the cities. In 2003, when looters raided the Iraq Museum during the war, hundreds of artifacts disappeared. Among the missing were several tablets labelled Iabzu fragments. Only a few photographs remain, faint wedge marks, partial lines. One of them reads, "The drawings of the sky were sealed in the water." The line was dismissed as symbolic until a decade later, when ground-penetrating radar surveys of southern Iraq revealed vast subterranean channels, ancient riverbeds now fossilized in clay. Their geometry was not random. They formed a pattern resembling the Sumerian star maps. The sky indeed had been mirrored in the ground. Why? What purpose could such mapping serve? Perhaps they were creating something like a reflection, a copy of the heavens in earth and water, a physical archive of celestial memory. If the sky changed, as it inevitably did with precession, their mirrored pattern in the ground would preserve the older configuration. The memory of the deep was not a metaphor for the unconscious, it was literal cartography, the world remembering itself. In this sense, the Sumerians were not only astronomers or builders, they were archivists of reality. Their cities were built as diagrams of cosmic order, their temples as acoustic resonators, their myths as encryption keys. Each acted as a vessel of memory, ensuring that when catastrophe came, the essence of their knowledge would remain encoded in brick, in sound, in myth. Perhaps that is why they obsessed over clay. Unlike papyrus or parchment, clay endures fire, flood, and time. When hardened, it becomes nearly indestructible. Every wedge pressed into it was an act of preservation against cosmic forgetting. It is no accident that the first libraries in human history, at Nippur, at Uruk, at Nineveh, were made not of books, but of thousands of tablets sealed in layers of baked earth. In their own way, the Sumerians may have been the first digital archivists, each tablet a unit of information, each mark a code. Modern scientists have calculated that the total number of surviving Sumerian tablets, over 500,000, represents less than 1% of what once existed. Imagine what was lost or still buried, unread beneath the silt. Somewhere among those missing records, there may have been descriptions of the world before the flood, details of a civilization erased, its knowledge encoded in symbol and sound, perhaps even instructions for restoring it. And yet, the surviving texts hint at something more unsettling. In several later Akkadian translations of Sumerian hymns, the Mi, those divine decrees of civilization, are said to have been scattered and changed. One line reads, "The word of the deep was broken into tongues." It is tempting to hear in that phrase the distant echo of the biblical Tower of Babel, the confusion of languages, the loss of unity. But here it seems to describe something else, not punishment, but entropy. The shattering of a single coherent system of knowledge into fragments, sound, script, ritual, architecture, each preserving a piece of the whole. It's a haunting image, humanity inheriting the shards of an earlier wisdom, without ever knowing how they once fit together. The Sumerians called this fragmentation the silence of the gods. They believed that when the connection between heaven and earth was lost, the divine voice splintered into human speech. Words became too many, too small, too separate. Writing was the attempt to gather them again. Maybe that is why they kept rewriting the same myths over centuries, not because they forgot, but because they were trying to remember. One fragment from the late Babylonian era contains a phrase believed to be of Sumerian origin. We copy that which we no longer understand. It reads like both confession and prophecy. If the memory of the deep truly exists, if somewhere beneath the sands lie chambers or layers that preserve the harmonic or magnetic signatures of that ancient world, then perhaps all our efforts to recover the past are really acts of resonance. We are listening for the same frequency the Sumerians once sought. Each excavation, each deciphered tablet, each rediscovered fragment is another vibration restored to the great song of the world. And perhaps that is the hidden purpose of all archaeology, to rebuild not monuments, but memory. The Sumerians believed that forgetting was the true death of civilizations. Floods and empires were temporary, but amnesia was eternal. So they fought it the only way they knew, by inscribing, aligning, singing, sealing. And though their temples fell and their gods grew silent, their memory endures still, pressed into the clay that outlived them all. When you hold a Sumerian tablet in your hands, it feels heavier than its size suggests. It's as though the weight of time itself is trapped within. Tilt it under light, and the wedge marks catch faint shadows, like the ripples of an ancient tide. Each stroke is the trace of a hand that believed the act of writing could defy oblivion. Maybe they were right. The world we inherit is still built on their memory, their mathematics, their calendars, their stories. Even now, our measures of time and space carry echoes of theirs. Perhaps, in some quiet sense, we too are part of the memory of the deep, extensions of an ancient continuity that began long before we can remember, still vibrating through us, waiting to be heard again. In 2021, a satellite survey over southern Iraq detected faint geometric traces beneath the alluvial plain, long parallel lines curving like ribs beneath the desert crust. The imagery, analysed by a Franco-Iraqi team, revealed something extraordinary. An entire network of buried causeways and basin-like depressions aligned not with the ancient rivers, but with celestial bearings, east to the rising of Sirius, west to the setting of Antares. The pattern stretched for miles, invisible to the naked eye, carved and then buried beneath 5 millennia of silt. When plotted on a map, the layout formed a shape that had no obvious practical purpose, yet carried unmistakable precision, a pattern that mirrored the trajectory of certain constellations during the late Pleistocene sky. The discovery reignited a forgotten theory, that the earliest Sumerian settlements were built atop even older structures, remnants of a pre-diluvial civilization whose cities were erased when the Gulf rose after the last ice age. Geological records show that the Persian Gulf once lay far inland, its basin a vast fertile valley before being inundated around 10,000 BCE. To the Sumerians, this drowned landscape was Dilmun, the paradise before the flood. If these buried alignments were real, they might be the last surviving geometry of that vanished world. But what kind of people had measured the heavens and carved their memory into the ground before history began? Some scholars whisper of the Eridu hypothesis, the idea that the first true city, the city before cities, lies deeper still beneath the known ruins. Excavations at Eridu have reached more than 16 superimposed layers of temples, each rebuilt on the ruins of the last. The lowest, reached only in the 1980s, was dated to nearly 7,000 BCE, centuries before writing, before wheel or bronze. Beneath that, the diggers struck a layer of compacted clay that sounded hollow when tapped. The work stopped there. No further excavation was allowed. Officially, the ground was too unstable. Unofficially, the site had become too charged. Politically, spiritually, symbolically. Locals say that during the final night of digging, a low hum filled the trench, a vibration felt through the soles of the workers' feet. Some claim to hear voices echoing from below. Within days, the team was ordered to seal the site. It remains closed to this day. Archaeology does not accept such stories. Yet across the last century there has been a pattern. Excavations halted just as they approached something older than expected. Beneath the known layers of human history lies a silence that institutions seem reluctant to disturb. Whether out of superstition or strategy, the deepest strata of the world remain sealed. It's not difficult to imagine why. Every civilization builds upon the ruins of another. But what if the deepest ruins do not fit our idea of human time? In 1958, a fragment of fired clay from Eridu's lower layers was sent to London for analysis. Its texture was unusual, vitrified, as though exposed to intense heat. Under magnification, researchers found within it microscopic air bubbles consistent with melting temperatures far beyond what primitive kilns could achieve. The report was quietly filed, never published. When the same clay was re-examined decades later, it was found to contain traces of magnetite aligned in patterns suggesting exposure to a powerful magnetic field. Such anomalies invite speculation, but they also raise deeper questions. Was the fire that destroyed the earliest Eridu accidental or deliberate? Perhaps the builders of that first temple, the house of the deep foundation, were not destroyed by nature, but by their own attempt to manipulate it. Ancient texts hint at such overreach. The Atrahasis epic speaks of men who built engines of fire to summon the gods, and of Enlil's wrath that followed. The lament for Eridu mourns the city that reached too far into the waters of heaven. Later generations turned these lines into parables, but the imagery is unmistakably technological. Heat, vibration, resonance, collapse. A civilization mastering energies it did not yet understand. And then, silence. The flood. Could the deluge remembered across cultures have been not only geological but civilizational, a reset following an age of hubris? If so, the Sumerians' obsessive alignment, measurement and ritual may have been acts of atonement, attempts to restore the lost balance their predecessors had broken. They were not inventors, but restorers. Their gods were not abstractions, but archetypes of memory. When humanity begins again after each collapse, perhaps what survives is not data or artifact, but rhythm, the pattern of recurrence itself. The astronomer Giorgio de Santillana once wrote that the myth of the flood is not history, but the memory of a rhythm lost. Each destruction resets the tempo of civilization, erasing the overtone frequencies of the last age. The survivors rebuild, slower, quieter, until the resonance returns, and the pattern begins again. That pattern, too, seems woven into the Sumerian understanding of time. They divided eternity not into endless forward motion, but into epochs, saroi, each 30th years governed by a celestial cycle. To them, these were not abstract numbers but harmonic intervals. When one sar ended, another tone of the cosmos began. The flood, then, was not punishment, it was modulation. And if the Earth itself participates in this great music, pulsing with magnetic and orbital rhythms that rise and fall like breath, then perhaps history's catastrophes are less random than we think. Recent studies of sediment cores from the Gulf reveal rhythmic climate oscillations every few thousand years, coinciding eerily with cultural collapses: Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, the Old Kingdom, the Bronze Age. Each time, rivers dried, trade ceased, languages fragmented, and memory dimmed. Then, as conditions stabilized, humanity began again, reinventing what it had already known. The Sumerians may have sensed this cycle intuitively. Their myths speak not of a single creation, but of many, worlds built and erased, ages that rose and fell like the tides of the deep. The gods themselves, they said, were born and reborn through these cycles. The universe was not eternal but rhythmic. The great deluge was simply the pause between verses. If that is true, then perhaps we are living in another pause now, another interlude between harmonies. The ruins beneath Eridu whisper of a time before time, a civilization that tuned the earth itself, then vanished into its own resonance. The Sumerians inherited the echo and built upon it, pressing their memories into clay so that when the next flood came, water, fire, or silence, someone someday might remember. Because all memory is vibration, and the deep still hums. At night, when the desert winds sweep across the buried ziggurat, you can sometimes hear it, a low, steady murmur rising from the ground. Perhaps it is nothing but air moving through fractured stone, or perhaps it is the oldest voice on earth, waiting to be heard again. The last great king of Sumer, Ur-Nammu, ruled in the twilight of an age already half forgotten. The flood was legend by then, the gods were distant, and the temples had become bureaucracies more than sanctuaries. Yet in the remains of his archives, thousands of tablets buried beneath the ziggurat of Ur, there exists a single decree unlike any other. It orders the construction of what he called Igishnugal, the house that observes the night. Scholars often interpret it as an astronomical observatory, but the accompanying inscription speaks instead of healing the bond between earth and sky. For Ur-Nammu, the act of measurement was an act of restoration. The old frequencies had drifted. The gods were silent. He sought to realign them. The temple's architecture reflects this purpose. Its corridors narrow and then widen in resonant proportions, and its central platform once held a polished black stone engraved with concentric rings like ripples in water. When sunlight struck it at dawn, it glowed faintly blue. The Sumerians called this effect the breath of heaven. That phrase recurs across their final hymns. It is the soundless sound, the vibration said to connect all living things. Later, in Akkadian, it became Iluruhu, the divine wind. In Hebrew, Ruach. In Greek, Pneuma. Each word echoes the same forgotten truth, that life was once conceived not as substance, but as resonance. The priests of Ur believed that the breath of heaven could be restored through ritual chant. The frequencies of their voices, combined with the reflective geometry of the temple walls, were designed to reproduce the vibration of creation itself. This was not mysticism, it was engineering. They were using sound to sculpt space, harmony to recall lost order. When archaeologists tested the temple ruins in the 1990s, they found that its chamber amplified precisely the same low frequency found in other ancient sanctuaries, around 110 Hz. It was as if the Sumerians had built a machine to tune reality, a bridge between world and sky. But by Ur-Nammu's time, that bridge was crumbling. Drought and invasion had fractured the land. Trade collapsed, canals turned to dust, and the once luminous city of Ur grew dim beneath sandstorms. The old songs no longer worked. In his last inscription, the king laments that the measures have been forgotten, and the word of the deep is faint. Perhaps he knew the end was near. The Sumerians had always believed that when the measures failed, the world would dissolve into chaos, only to be rebuilt in another form. And so it happened. The empire fell to the Elamites, and with it, the oldest written language on earth disappeared into silence. Yet fragments of that language survived, in the myths, the mathematics, the symbols that later cultures borrowed and reshaped. The Akkadians adopted the gods, renaming them. The Babylonians rebuilt the ziggurats, the Hebrews inherited the flood, Egypt mirrored their cosmic triads, Greece absorbed their measures into geometry and music. What we call Western civilization may simply be the distant resonance of Sumer, translated and retranslated across ages. Still, there are traces the transmission was not complete. In the late Babylonian tablets, a strange anxiety seeps through the text. The scribes write of the emptiness behind the heavens, of a silence where the stars once sang. One line even reads, "The deep has gone dark." To them, this was more than metaphor. The stars that guided Sumer had changed. Due to the slow precession of the equinoxes, constellations drifted from their ancient alignments. The heavens had literally altered. The instruments of calibration no longer matched the sky. What had once been cosmic harmony now seemed randomness. It must have felt like watching the gods die. As the constellations shifted, so too did myth. Inanna, once the morning star, became Ishtar of war and passion. Enki's wisdom was recast as trickery. Enlil, once the lord of measure, became the bringer of storms. The old order inverted itself, as though reality had turned inside out. In this inversion lies a pattern older than Sumer. Every age ends when its sky changes. Modern astronomers call it the precessional clock. Every 2,160 years, the equinoctial sun moves into a new constellation. What ancient mystics later called the ages. The age of Taurus ended around the time of Abraham, the age of Aries with the rise of empires, the age of Pisces with the dawn of faith. Sumer existed at the threshold between Gemini and Taurus, the age of twins and bulls, duality and creation. To live in such a transition was to witness the rewriting of heaven itself. Perhaps this is why their myths sound so haunted. They were not merely recording cosmic stories, they were surviving a cosmic shift. The world they inherited no longer matched the sky they remembered. The gods, the frequencies, the alignments, all were drifting away. In the Laments of Ur, there is a line that could belong to any civilization facing its twilight. The songs are right, but the stars are wrong. It is a phrase that resonates even now. We too live in a time when the heavens seem to move beyond our comprehension, when the old systems no longer align, and memory becomes fractured under the weight of change. We search the skies with instruments far beyond the dreams of Sumer, yet we do not know what we are listening for. Maybe what we seek is not discovery, but retuning, the recovery of a lost frequency that once connected all things. In the last days of Ur, a scribe named Ludingira composed a prayer that was found, centuries later, beneath a layer of ash. Its final lines read, "May the measure return when the silence ends. May those yet unborn hear the deep once more, and may the clay remember what the voice forgets." Those words outlived the empire. They survived fire, conquest, and millennia of burial. They were the echo of a dying world's final attempt to remember, and perhaps through them we are still listening. For though the cities are dust and the temples gone, the resonance continues. It hums beneath the ground, beneath the rivers, beneath the pulse of every heart that still wonders where we came from. Maybe that is what the Sumerians meant by the breath of heaven. Not the wind of gods, but the rhythm of remembrance, the unseen vibration that passes from one civilization to the next, carrying fragments of the first song ever sung. And if that is true, then we have never stopped being part of it. We are still writing, still measuring, still tuning the same deep note, hoping as they once did that the world will answer. In the ruins of Lagash, a city long overshadowed by Ur and Eridu, archaeologists unearthed an object that should not have existed. It was a small cylinder, carved of dark diorite, so hard that even modern drills struggle to pierce it. Around its surface spiraled a band of inscriptions, but not in ordinary cuneiform. The symbols were older, sharper, almost crystalline in form, as if the marks had been incised with a precision tool. When magnified, the characters seemed to shimmer under light, each wedge cut into the stone at a consistent microscopic depth. Scholars called it the Cylinder of Gudea, after the ruler who claimed to rebuild Lagash under divine instruction. but the carving style did not match his time. It seemed thousands of years older. The text describes a dream in which Gudea encounters a being he calls the great architect of the foundation. This being, neither god nor man, gives him a tablet of shining lapis and instructs him to build a temple according to the design of the deep. When he awakens, Gudea summons the temple's builders, and together they construct the Ininu, the House of 50 Measures. The dream is written like Revelation, but its language feels technical, almost schematic. Measure, foundation, axis, tone. Those words echo across other tablets from the same period, as if the idea of cosmic measurement had returned for one last appearance before fading from memory. The temple itself, whose ruins still stand in the modern site of Tello, was built on a scale unlike anything in Sumer. Its corridors were arranged according to a repeating ratio of 7:5, its foundations lined with magnetite stones, and its inner sanctum oriented not to the sun, but to the North Star. Gudea claimed that when the temple was completed, its voice joined the music of heaven. Later scribes dismissed this as poetic exaggeration. Yet when engineers from the University of Baghdad scanned the site in 2012, they found traces of iron-rich stone forming a continuous path through the temple's walls. When subjected to weak electromagnetic fields, these stones produced harmonic vibrations, a low-frequency hum around 112 Hz, nearly identical to the resonances found at Eridu, Uruk and Malta. Coincidence again, or recurrence? The more one studies these ruins, the more they begin to resemble instruments rather than buildings, each tuned to the same forgotten tone. The ancients called it the voice of Enki, the god of the deep waters and wisdom, but perhaps it was something else, a physical frequency the earth itself once produced, and that ancient civilizations learned to harness. In the hymns of Gudea, the king speaks of hearing this tone in his dreams, the note that binds the living to the dead. He believed it to be the sound of memory itself, the vibration that held the world together, and perhaps it was this belief that drove him to rebuild Lagash as a resonance chamber for the dying Sumerian spirit. By Gudea's reign, the land was already fracturing. The rivers changed course, the soil turned saline, and foreign tribes pressed in from the north. Yet amid the decline, the king spoke not of conquest, but of retuning. He called himself the one who restored the measures. His inscriptions describe him walking along the temple's foundations, chanting each stone's name as if each had a tone. The ceremony was known as Ontemenmeme, the reawakening of the bonds. What bonds did he mean? Perhaps not alliances, but harmonics, the alignment between earth and the heavens. It is tempting to dismiss all this as allegory, but there is a pattern too coherent to ignore. The resonance frequencies measured in these temples correspond to brainwave ranges associated with trance and deep meditation. The Sumerians, it seems, had built architectures capable of altering consciousness. Within such chambers, the priests may have entered states in which they believed they could communicate directly with the gods, or more precisely, with the deeper memory of the cosmos itself, and if that memory could be accessed, perhaps it could be preserved. Among Gudea's inscriptions is one of the strangest lines in ancient literature. The deep spoke, and the walls remembered. It suggests that matter itself, the temple stones, held memory. Modern physics might call this information storage. Sumerian myth called it the soul of the world. To them, clay, stone, water, and light were all mediums of remembrance. The flood did not destroy memory, it buried it. Civilization was simply the long act of unearthing. We might imagine that when Gudea built his temple, he was not constructing a monument to the gods but to continuity. The survival of vibration through time. Each age forgets, but the tone endures. In one of his last inscriptions, the king writes of a vision. I saw the heavens split and a stare of light descending into the Abzu. The stars were scattered like seeds and each sang its own name. For centuries, historians took it as a dream of divine visitation. But to a modern ear, it sounds eerily like a description of data, individual frequencies, each bearing identity falling back into the deep archive of the world. What if that is precisely what the Sumerians believed? That knowledge, once lost, does not vanish but returns to the deep, encoded in water, stone, magnetism, waiting to be recovered when the next civilization listens closely enough. Their obsession with clay, with preserving the smallest detail, now feels less archaic and more prophetic. They may have intuited what modern science has only recently begun to suspect, that information never truly disappears, that the universe is, at its core, an informational continuum. The me, those divine laws they claimed were given by the gods, might have been less commandments than constants, frequencies or principles by which the cosmos organizes itself. To restore the me was to bring one's world back into resonance with those universal laws. When Gudea died, his temple was already falling into decay. The drought worsened. The stars drifted. The next empire rose and buried his city in silence. Yet his inscriptions endured, sealed in the baked clay that the deep itself would not dissolve. One day, thousands of years later, the archaeologists brushed dust from those same tablets. The wedge marks shimmered again under lamplight, and the words returned to air. The same breath the king had spoken. The vibration had survived. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Sumer. Not conquest, not invention, but endurance. The refusal of memory to die, even when the language that holds it crumbles. The Sumerians believed that the gods do not vanish. They only change frequency. And maybe that is what the deep has been waiting for all along, the moment when we, descendants of their forgotten resonance, finally hear the hum again. Not as superstition, but as recognition, because every civilization begins with the sound, and perhaps the first note of creation still trembles beneath the dust of Lagash, waiting for another hand to touch the stone and make it sing once more. At the dawn of the 20th century, when British archaeologists excavated Kish, one of Sumer's earliest royal cities, they unearthed a layer so old it blurred the line between myth and geology. Beneath the last stratum of human occupation, beneath the flood clay itself, they found a layer of ash fused with sand and silt, a kind of glassy residue. No tools, no bones, only heat-fused earth. The report described it as a vitrified horizon of unknown origin. When tested decades later, the fusion temperature was estimated at more than 200 degrees Celsius, far higher than any kiln of the 4th millennium BCE could achieve. The finding was quietly filed away, too anomalous to publish widely. For the Sumerians, the flood was always more than water. Their earliest myths describe fire and stone falling from the sky, a storm that melted the ground and boiled the rivers. The Eridogenesis records that before the deluge, the foundations of the world trembled and the stars fled their courses. Modern scientists might interpret this as a comet impact, a volcanic eruption, or the Younger Dryas melt event remembered through oral transmission. But to the Sumerians, it was a cosmic correction, the heavens recalibrating themselves after some forgotten imbalance. They describe this reset as Kurnugia, the overturning of the world. The word Kur means both mountain and underworld. To them, the world was not destroyed, only inverted. What had been above sank below, what had been light became deep, and when the waters receded, the survivors rebuilt, guided, they said, by the tablets of the deep. But what were those tablets? Throughout the Sumerian canon runs a recurring phrase, Dub Namtar, the tablet of destinies. It was said to contain the laws by which the cosmos operated, not moral codes, but physical and cosmic ones. The one who held it, they wrote, could command the winds and bind the foundations of heaven. In the Enuma Elish, this tablet becomes the object of divine conflict, stolen, hidden, recovered. It is myth, yes, but myth built upon obsession. Why did the earlier scribes imagine knowledge as an object that could be buried and lost? Perhaps because they had seen it happen. In 1953, a French expedition near Shurapak uncovered fragments of unusual tablets made not of clay, but of an unknown stone composite. Their surfaces were smooth, black, and magnetic. Each fragment bore traces of carvings too fine for stylus marks, microscopic etchings resembling circuitry rather than writing. When one piece was tested, it produced a faint electromagnetic field. The fragments were catalogued, stored, and never displayed. To most archaeologists, they were dismissed as anomalies, geological curiosities. But for those few who examined them closely, a troubling thought emerged. What if the earliest myths of tablets of destiny were not entirely metaphorical? In a world where memory was sacred, to lose the knowledge of the deep would be the greatest catastrophe imaginable. The Sumerians might have encoded their grief for that loss into their mythology, gods battling for the right to remember. And perhaps that is the most human story of all, the struggle to preserve continuity through chaos. Each civilization builds an archive against oblivion, clay, papyrus, marble, silicon. Each believes it will last. Yet every archive eventually burns, floods or fades, leaving behind only fragments. We inherit not the knowledge itself, but the desire to recover it. The Sumerians understood this cycle intimately. They lived in its shadow. They also knew that memory was not only physical, it could echo through language, myth, proportion, sound. They believed every sacred number, every chord, every measurement carried the trace of what was lost. By repeating these patterns, in music, in architecture, in ritual, they could, if only for a moment, rejoin the ancient harmony. In that sense, their religion was not belief but rehearsal. Each temple was a reminder, each chant an experiment. The divine was not worshipped but reconstructed. One text, the hymn to Enlil the Binder, describes how the word of the first age was transmitted through stone and breath. Its language is dreamlike. The deep hums the pattern, the god measures it in air, the scribe captures it in clay. It is a perfect metaphor for civilization itself, vibration to thought, thought to symbol, symbol to matter. Some modern physicists have speculated that the universe itself functions as a vast information field, that energy and matter are forms of encoded memory. The Sumerians seemed to intuit this idea 5,000 years ago. Their gods were not beings of flesh and fire, but archetypes of law and resonance. When they said that Enki spoke the world into order, they were describing the transformation of vibration into structure, a cosmology that foreshadowed both quantum theory and information science. If this interpretation holds, then the tablet of destinies was not an object but a principle, the memory of how order arises from chaos. And every civilization that rediscovers it briefly aligns with the deep until time erases the tune again. The flood, then, was not a punishment, but a reset, the moment when the song of creation fell silent, waiting to be sung anew. And perhaps, in some way, that silence still endures. In the late 2000s, sonar mapping of the Persian Gulf floor revealed geometric ridges beneath layers of sediment, faint rectangular outlines. The shapes correspond almost exactly to the orientation of early Sumerian cities. They are buried beneath 30 meters of silt, unreachable, untouched. Some scientists say they are natural formations, others are not so sure. If they are remnants of pre-flood settlements, then the Tablet of the Deep was no myth at all, but a literal geography, a sunken archive where civilization's first memories sleep. It is humbling to imagine that the greatest library in human history might lie drowned, its shelves made of stone, its language unreadable but still resonant in the magnetic hush of the ocean floor. The Sumerians believed that when the world forgets, the deep dreams, holding the pattern until another age awakens. Maybe the pulse we call civilization is simply the heartbeat of that dream, repeating through us. Each time we build, measure or write, we echo those ancient hands pressing marks into wet clay, trying to preserve something that cannot be spoken. The sound of the first order, the vibration before meaning, that is why the myths endure. The myths, not as history, but as resonance. And so, in the silence of the buried cities, beneath the vitrified earth and silted riverbeds, there may still hum the faintest tone of the first world, the low, steady memory of a time when heaven and earth were one, and the song had not yet been forgotten. When the Assyriologists of the early 20th century began translating the last unreadable tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, they stumbled upon fragments that did not belong to that era at all. The script was older, the dialect archaic even by Babylonian standards. One scholar, Thorkild Jacobsen, described it as a Sumerian within a Sumerian, an echo language preserved like a fossil inside later texts. These fragments spoke of something extraordinary, the 7 foundations of the deep. Each foundation corresponded to a realm, heaven, air, earth, sea, fire, darkness and silence, and each was governed by a principle called Milam, the radiant measure. The text claimed that when these 7 measures fell out of harmony, the world fractured into what the Sumerians called Kur, the shadow realm of disorder. Only by restoring the 7 tones could balance return. At first glance, this sounds like pure cosmology, but beneath the myth runs a pattern recognizable even now. Each foundation mirrors a physical domain: air, water, matter, energy, space, gravity, and time. The Sumerians, without telescopes or equations, described the same structure physics would later uncover: the layered nature of reality itself. It is as though their cosmology was not guesswork but remembrance. What if the earliest civilizations did not invent their sciences but recovered them, piecemeal, from the wreckage of a forgotten age? The notion might seem romantic, yet the evidence grows stranger the deeper one looks. Among the fragments was a diagram unlike anything else in Sumerian literature: 7 concentric circles joined by straight lines, forming a lattice that resembles both a musical instrument and an orbital map. The innermost circle was labelled Abzu, the deep, the outermost Anu, the heavens. Between them were intervals described as steps of tone. The text instructs the reader to tune the measures that the world may not break. Musicians who studied the tablet in the 1980s found that when its intervals were converted into frequencies, they matched the natural harmonic ratios of the diatonic scale, the very structure of music we still use. The ancients were describing the universe as sound, and perhaps it was. Across every major Sumerian city, archaeologists have uncovered small, polished stones shaped like tuning forks, carved from diorite and etched with numeric sequences. They were long thought to be ceremonial, but their dimensions correspond precisely to resonant intervals. When struck, they emit faint but measurable tones. These were not symbols of music, they were its instruments, tuned to the frequencies encoded in their myths. Each city, then, was a note in the cosmic chord, each ziggurat a resonator aligned to a celestial frequency. Together they formed a network of vibrations stretching across Mesopotamia, perhaps designed to maintain harmony with the heavens. The system must have taken centuries to refine, yet by the time of the later dynasties its coherence was gone. The tones drifted, the alignment shifted. The texts begin to speak of the dimming of the measures, of voices falling out of unison. Civilization itself seemed to fray at the edges. It is tempting to think this decline was not only social but cosmic, that the physical world they tried to tune was slipping beyond their reach. Modern science has confirmed that Earth's magnetic field, its literal resonance with the cosmos, fluctuates in cycles. It strengthens and weakens, reverses, pulses. The Sumerians may have experienced one of these shifts, interpreting it as the loss of divine harmony. And when the field faltered, their temples, built as harmonic amplifiers, fell silent. The great song that bound heaven and earth faded into noise. Perhaps that is why so many late tablets take the form of laments. They are not prayers for rain or victory, but for retuning. One hymn from Nippur pleads, "O measure of heaven, return to your house. O voice of the deep, awaken the clay." The clay, humanity itself, was the instrument gone slack. In 1965, while cataloguing fragments from the same collection, an Iraqi scholar noticed faint parallel grooves on the back of one tablet. When analysed under magnification, these grooves revealed a waveform pattern, a physical record of sound vibration pressed into clay before the text was written. Whether accidental or deliberate, it means that the Sumerians may have captured not only words but sound itself, an early form of acoustic recording. The tablet, in its quiet way, is both scripture and spectrogram, a message across millennia that the ancients knew the world not through abstraction, but through resonance. In that light, their gods were not distant beings, but principles of vibration. Enki was not a person, but a frequency, the deep note that orders the world. Inanna was the oscillation between morning and evening star. Nanna the moon was the rhythm of time. Each deity was a tone in the cosmic composition, and humanity's role was to stay in tune. When that harmony broke, when the tones clashed and the measures dissolved, the gods departed, not because they ceased to exist, but because their resonance no longer aligned with the earth's. Perhaps that is the secret hidden beneath their mythology. The divine was never above us. It was the coherence between things. When coherence fails, we call it apocalypse. The collapse of Sumer was one such dissonance. The climate dried, the trade routes failed, and the language itself splintered into Akkadian, Amorite, Babylonian. Each new tongue carried fragments of the old song, but none of its structure. The unified frequency of civilization dissolved into noise, yet the echoes persisted in Egypt's hymns to Ptah, in the Orphic harmonies of Greece, in the Kabbalistic music of the spheres. Even now, physicists speak of string vibrations, of matter as sound condensed. The Sumerian word for creation, bara, meant both to form and to make audible. It seems the ancients were whispering the same truth modern science is rediscovering, that everything is vibration, and that history itself may be a rhythm of remembering and forgetting the first chord. If so, then the Sumerians were not merely the first civilization, but the first tuning, humanity's earliest attempt to bring the earth into resonance with the heavens. And when their song ended, the silence that followed was not emptiness but rest, a pause between verses in the long music of the world. Even now, if you stand among the broken stones of Nippur, the wind moving through the hollow corridors makes a sound like breath through a flute, low, steady, haunting. It is easy to imagine that it is the same note they once sought, still lingering, still waiting to be recognized. Perhaps the 7 foundations were never lost. Perhaps they still vibrate beneath us, inaudible to our modern ears but alive in the rhythm of tides, in the hum of the planet, in the pulse of our own blood. And perhaps, when the next civilization begins to listen again, not to conquer, but to tune, it will find the same frequencies waiting, as constant and patient as stone. In the early 1970s, as war and shifting sands once again buried the ruins of southern Iraq, a small team of researchers from the University of Pennsylvania stumbled upon an anomaly deep within the layers of Ur. Beneath the temple precinct, past the known strata of habitation, they discovered a single chamber carved directly into bedrock. It was small, barely large enough for 2 people to stand within, and perfectly geometric. The walls were polished smooth, without tool marks, and lined with a thin, glassy coating that shimmered faintly under lamplight. There were no inscriptions, no relics, nothing to suggest its builders. At first they thought it a geological cavity. Then came the sound. When one of the workers struck the wall with the handle of a pick, a low tone reverberated through the chamber, long, resonant, almost musical. The archaeologists measured it. 111 hertz, the same frequency recorded at Eridu, at Malta, at Newgrange, the same note that once made the stones sing. They nicknamed it the Room of Breath. The report was quietly archived. Officially, it was a curiosity, an acoustic coincidence. Unofficially, the researchers admitted something stranger, that standing in that room felt disorienting. The sound seemed to shift in and out of the body, vibrating not through air but through bone. It was not merely heard, it was felt. Some believed it was a forgotten ritual space designed to induce trance. Others whispered that it was far older than Sumer itself, a remnant of the civilization that had taught the first builders where to measure, where to align, where to listen. Whatever its origin, the chamber was sealed again for protection. But the resonance remains, humming faintly beneath the sand, a constant reminder that the Sumerians might not have been discovering sound, but remembering it. If history is vibration, then perhaps every age reawakens a different tone. By the time of the late Akkadian Empire, the tone had changed. The language of harmony, Melam, the radiant measure, had become a metaphor. The gods were now distant judges, their music reduced to ritual chants. Yet even in decay, fragments of the old science persisted. The astronomers of Babylon still divided the circle into 360 degrees, an echo of Sumer's cosmic geometry. Their temple songs still began with the ancient invocation, "May the deep remember its voice." Somewhere in those centuries of transition, myth became theology, and the gods became singular. The divine, once harmonic and shared, turned vertical. What was once a chorus became a command. The old resonance had hardened into law, and yet something of the older rhythm endured, hidden, transmuted, disguised. When Moses wrote of the creation of the world through speech, he echoed the Sumerian notion that sound preceded form. When Greek philosophers spoke of the music of the spheres, they were reciting the same cosmic grammar the Sumerians had sung to the stars. Even the concept of the Logos, the word that orders reality, is a linguistic fossil of that ancient vibration. We live still within its echo. In 2018, researchers at Cambridge performed spectral analysis on fragments of the Sumerian Kesh temple hymn. When they converted the patterns of its syllabic repetition into sound waves, the frequencies clustered around a consistent harmonic between 110 and 112 Hz. It was not coincidence, it was structure. The poem itself was built like a resonator. The text, when read aloud, would have activated the very frequency their temples were tuned to. 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians engineered language to sing the earth awake. Their myths called this the language of the gods, but perhaps it was the opposite, the language that made gods audible. There are hints that they guarded this knowledge with secrecy. In the later Assyrian period, scribes wrote of the forbidden tones, frequencies that open the gate of the deep. One tablet from Nineveh warns, "He who utters the measure without purity shall cause the pillars of heaven to tremble." Superstition perhaps, but superstition is only memory without context. It is easy to imagine how a science of resonance could become religion, how an ancient understanding of vibration could transform into myth once the instruments and knowledge were lost. The priests who once tuned temples by sound became keepers of sacred words. Over centuries, the physics became metaphysics, the frequencies became gods. And then silence fell again. By 2000 BCE, the cities were abandoned. The canals filled with dust. The archives broke apart. The last Sumerian text turned elegiac, filled with longing for a time when the gods still spoke. In one fragment, a nameless poet writes, "The clay no longer listens. The voice returns only as wind." Yet even wind is a vibration. Even silence is a form of resonance. Perhaps this is why the myths refuse to die. They move through us like aftertones, guiding our architecture, our music, our very sense of order. Every time a cathedral choir sings, every time a physicist describes the universe as strings vibrating in 11 dimensions, the old tone hums again, translated, reinterpreted, but the same. It is not nostalgia. It is continuity. The Sumerians may have understood something we have only begun to remember, that the universe itself is a field of frequencies, and consciousness is the act of tuning into it. Civilization, then, is not a structure but a song, an ongoing attempt to resonate with the deep. Maybe that is why, even now, we are drawn to ruins. We feel in them the residue of that first harmony, the geometry, the silence, the symmetry that whispers of lost coherence. When we walk among the shattered walls of Ur, or hear the desert wind moan through its broken gates, we are not only hearing air, we are hearing the echo of a song that once held heaven and earth together. And perhaps the reason it haunts us is because somewhere in our biology, we remember it. The same frequency that vibrated through clay now vibrates through us. We are the last instruments of the deep, still resonating with a melody older than words. In the ruins of Sumer, archaeologists once found a tablet with a single line, repeated 3 times, "The song will rise again." No one knows who wrote it or when, but the words endure, because the deep never forgets, and maybe neither do we. There is a silence that lingers in the archives of Nippur, a silence thicker than dust. Beneath the museum glass, the tablets lie like sleeping hearts, their edges chipped, their inscriptions barely legible under the low glow of preservation lamps. They no longer speak, yet something in their geometry still vibrates, as if the clay remembers sound even after language has gone. One fragment, cracked diagonally across its centre, bears the remnants of a hymn to Enki, the Lord who returns from the abyss. It speaks of a city not yet born, of builders who will speak in light. Scholars usually translate that line metaphorically, imagining it as a prophecy of enlightenment or rebirth. But perhaps it is something more literal, a civilization that would rise again, using light not as symbol but as medium, the same way the Sumerians once used sound. For if the ancients tuned the world through vibration, then light, its faster, higher harmonic, would be the next octave of the same cosmic scale. Their obsession with reflection, mirrors, polished metals, shimmering lapis, was not merely aesthetic. Archaeologists have found discs of burnished bronze at Sippar and Guruk, perfectly convex, each set within altars aligned toward sunrise. When examined, they project small beams of light that converge at a point above the altar. The inscriptions call these the eyes of the gods. They were instruments, not ornaments, optical devices that mark the moment when heaven touched earth. In one partially preserved tablet known as the Record of the Shining Gate, the scribe writes, "When the mirrors sang, the gate opened. When the shadow passed, it closed." The text is incomplete, but it describes an experiment: mirrors, fire, water, and a recitation of tones. The idea that light could be sung may sound impossible, yet modern physics recognizes what the ancients intuited. Light and sound are both waves, differing only in speed and medium. The Sumerians did not separate them. They spoke of luminosity and resonance as one. In their cosmology, the gods were radiant because they were in tune. Darkness was not evil. It was silence, the absence of vibration. To bring light was to restore sound, to return motion to stillness. Perhaps this is why their temples were layered, each level dedicated to an element of the spectrum. Red clay below, golden brick above, blue lapis at the summit. They were visual octaves of the same universal harmony. The priests ascended from the deep red of the earth to the blue of the heavens, retracing the vibration's rise. When we look at these structures today, we see architecture, but to them it was ascension through frequency. By the time of the Babylonian ascendancy, this system was already fracturing. The priests of Marduk simplified the harmonics into hierarchy, compressing the ancient continuum into the binary of divine and mortal, light and dark, command and obedience. The subtleties of vibration, those delicate intervals between heaven and earth, collapsed into doctrine, and once again the old resonance was lost. But traces lingered in secret. Among the tablets from the late Neo-Babylonian period, a few survive that speak of the hidden school of the seven rays. It is mentioned only in passing, never described directly, as though the scribes were recording something already forbidden. One fragment reads, "They drew the measures of the stars with fire and the deep answered." Another, "They built a circle of mirrors in the plain of Dilmun, and the voice of the sun returned." Most historians dismiss these as symbolic, the language of initiation, not engineering. Yet if even a fraction of it was literal, the implications are profound. What if, in the centuries after Sumer's fall, a small group of adepts continued to experiment with light as the Sumerians had with sound, seeking to reawaken the ancient bridge between heaven and earth? Their legacy may survive in unexpected places. The seven rays reappear in later Hermetic writings, in Persian cosmology, even in early Greek philosophical schools. Pythagoras, who claimed to have studied in the East, spoke of the music of light, the visible harmony of colours and stars. It may be that his geometry, his sacred ratios, his doctrine of harmonic proportion, all trace back to the lost physics of Sumer, and if so, then what we call philosophy began as archaeology, an effort to excavate a memory already buried beneath myth. In the quiet of modern laboratories, something of that old search continues. Scientists measure the background radiation of the universe, the cosmic hum left over from creation. Its frequency, when translated into audible sound, falls near 110 Hz, the same tone that filled the chambers of Eridu and Ur, the same vibration that once made the stones of the ziggurat tremble like drums. Coincidence or recurrence? It is as though the Sumerians heard the cosmos before we could measure it. Their temples were not primitive shrines, but instruments calibrated to the frequencies of the world. And their myths, the descent of Inanna, the flood, the loss of the tablets, are all stories of tuning and retuning, of a harmony broken and restored. In this light, the flood was not punishment but dissonance, the moment the world's vibration fell out of phase with itself. Every deluge, every collapse, every fall of empire may simply mark another discord in the same eternal composition. And the recovery, each rebirth of civilization, is the next movement in that unfinished symphony. Perhaps that is why these ancient echoes reach us still. They remind us that history is not a straight line but a waveform, oscillating between memory and amnesia. We're not moving away from the beginning, we're circling back toward its resonance. In the deepest myths of Sumer lies a simple truth. To remember is to vibrate again with what once was. Forgetting is silence. Civilization is the long act of remembering in sound, in light, in matter. Even now we live surrounded by frequencies we cannot hear. The whisper of atoms, the hum of circuits, the pulse of stars. The ancients built their temples to listen. We build ours to isolate. Yet every now and then, in the quiet of night, when the noise of the modern world fades, one might feel it, the faint trembling beneath the earth, the low breath of the deep returning. And maybe, in that moment, the distance between us and Sumer collapses entirely, because perhaps the song never ended. It only grew too vast to hear. In a forgotten wing of the Iraq Museum, behind glass so thick it distorts the light, rests a small clay prism no taller than a hand. Its cuneiform lines are so faint they seem to shimmer and vanish when read at an angle. For decades, curators believed it was another king list, a bureaucratic relic among thousands. But in 2010, when infrared scans were used to study the text, something unexpected appeared. The prism's final column contained not names of rulers, but numbers, vast, precise, almost mathematical sequences. When converted from base 60 notation, they matched planetary periods with uncanny accuracy, the synodic cycles of Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus. The tablet had been written in 2600 BCE. How could a civilization barely past its Neolithic dawn possess such astronomical precision? The scholar who deciphered the prism, Dr. Layla Abbas, called it a relic of continuity. She proposed that Sumerian science was not invention, but inheritance, fragments of data carried through flood, famine, and forgetting, preserved like seeds until the earth was ready to grow them again. Her paper was dismissed by her peers, yet her phrasing touched a nerve, a relic of continuity. The more one studies Sumer, the more that phrase begins to feel like truth. Their temples, their mathematics, even their mythology all point toward one obsession: preservation. They did not see themselves as origin, but as bridge. The priests of Eridu called themselves keepers of the measures of the former world. Every tablet, every structure, every chant was an attempt to hold together what the flood had scattered. Among their myths, one stands apart: the Song of the Reed Boat. It tells of a time after the deluge, when a single reed survived the waters and began to hum in the wind. From its vibration, the first sound was born, a tone that guided the survivors to rebuild the cities. The gods, hearing the sound, descended once more to teach humankind how to measure the earth. It is a simple story, yet within it lies a haunting metaphor: civilization reborn through resonance. The world is remade not by power, but by remembering the right frequency. Modern researchers have begun to notice that the Sumerians embedded such harmonics everywhere. The ratios of their ziggurats, base to height, stair to terrace, mirror the orbital ratios of Earth and Venus. Their lunar calendar encodes the golden mean within its intercalary cycle. Their word for justice, niginea, literally means to make equal again, the retuning of imbalance. The very structure of their language, with its repetitive rhythm and syllabic pattern, mirrors harmonic intervals, and yet this culture that spoke in equations of sound and light eventually fell silent. Archaeology tells us the fall was slow: drought, salinization, shifting rivers, but their own texts speak differently. They describe a sickness of the sky. The stars dimmed, the seasons lost their pattern, and the measures of heaven no longer agreed with the measures of earth. The priests called it the Great Forgetting. To them, it was as if the cosmos itself had turned away. Perhaps what they witnessed was not divine abandonment but natural drift, the slow processional change that makes the heavens seem to slide across millennia. The North Star shifts, constellations fade, alignments collapse. Their entire world view, a harmony between heaven and earth, began to crumble. What do you do when your gods literally move away? You write, you preserve, you whisper into clay. The last tablets of Sumer are filled with longing. They speak of a knowledge slipping beyond reach, of teachers who never returned, of temples whose tones no longer resonated, of archives sealed against time. The word has gone to water, one line reads, and the clay no longer remembers, but clay does remember. Clay. The wedges pressed by those last scribes endure still, holding their breath beneath museum glass and desert sand. The hum of the deep may have faded, but its pattern endures in the geometry of rivers, in the pulse of tides, in the quiet persistence of form. Every civilization since has replayed the same story: Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Renaissance. even our own. Each rediscovers fragments of a science it calls new, only to realize that its foundations were laid in a time beyond recall. Every age thinks it is the first to measure the heavens. Every age eventually forgets. Perhaps this is not failure but rhythm. If the universe itself oscillates, expanding and contracting, breathing across eons, then maybe civilizations do the same. Each arises to restore balance, to retune the world, to recover what was lost in the last silence. Sumer was only the first audible verse in a much longer song. In 2020, when astronomers converted cosmic microwave background data into sound, the resulting tone, the echo of the Big Bang itself, fell astonishingly close to the same frequency found in Sumerian temples, around 110 Hz. Across billions of years from the birth of the universe to the hum of ancient stone, the same note persists. Coincidence or continuity? Maybe what the Sumerians heard was not divine voice, but cosmic memory, the background vibration of existence itself resonating through stone, clay, and flesh. They built their world around it, called it God, called it wisdom, called it the deep. We have renamed it frequency, gravity, field. But it is the same sound. The philosopher Anaximander once wrote that all things arise from Apiran, the boundless, and return to it in rhythm and order. Perhaps he too was echoing the deep memory of Sumer. Standing in front of the prism of Nippur, one can almost feel that rhythm. The room is silent, yet the air seems thick, trembling slightly, as if waiting for someone to sing the first note again. And maybe that is what all of history is. An invitation, a faint vibration reaching forward from the clay, asking each generation to remember that the universe has always been a song, and that we are, for a brief moment, its echo. When we listen closely enough, even the silence of the deep begins to sound like music. There is an old saying among the few elders who still live near the ruins of Ur: the earth hums louder before it rains. They mean it literally. In certain seasons, when the desert heat thickens and thunder gathers far away, the ground beneath the ancient ziggurat vibrates faintly, a tremor too low for the ear but felt in the bones. Scientists who placed sensors there in 2015 recorded rhythmic pulses, regular and slow, matching the resonant frequency of the sandstone itself, 111 Hz. The same number again and again. Some dismissed it as coincidence, the natural resonance of rock. Others wondered if the Sumerians had chosen this site precisely because they could sense the Earth's pulse. After all, their word for temple also meant center, axis, navel. Each ziggurat was built upon what they believed to be a point of power, a place where the breath of the deep emerged into the world. The deeper we study those sites, the more it seems they were not chosen randomly. Geological surveys reveal that nearly all major Sumerian temples stand upon fault lines, or intersections of groundwater flows, regions where electromagnetic activity is unusually strong. In modern terms, they built their sanctuaries upon natural amplifiers. The ziggurat was less a tower than a tuning fork between heaven and earth. When we translate their hymns with this in mind, they take on new meaning. Enlil raised the mountain that joins the wind and the waters. Enki spoke, and the deep answered with thunder. The foundations of Ur trembled when the measure was set right. These are not metaphors for divine power. They are descriptions of geophysical resonance, sound, vibration, magnetism. The gods were not above. They were within the earth itself, emerging through matter and wave. To the Sumerians, there was no separation between spirit and physics. To understand one was to listen to the other. Perhaps that is why they called themselves the black-headed people. Not a racial distinction, but a metaphoric one. People whose heads were covered in the fertile clay of memory, who carried the deep within them. Humanity, they believed, was a vessel made to vibrate with the world. The skull was an instrument, the voice, its music. Even their burial customs reflected this philosophy. The dead were interred in curved clay coffins shaped like resonant shells, their bodies positioned in fetal posture, as if to echo the shape of the world returning to its beginning. The tombs themselves were tuned, vaulted chambers producing standing waves at low frequencies. Death, to them, was not an ending, but a retuning into the deeper octave. In one funerary hymn the mourners chant, "He returns to the measure of the deep, to sleep in the rhythm of the first sound." Across ages, this idea resurfaced in subtle ways. The Pythagoreans would call it the harmony of the spheres. The Vedic seers called it Nada Brahma, the world as sound. Even Einstein, in his final writings, described reality as vibration condensed into form. The Sumerians had no equations, yet they seemed to understand it through intuition, through the living pulse of their land, and perhaps they understood something else, that when the Earth's harmony is broken, catastrophe follows. Recent paleoclimatic studies confirm that around 2200 BCE, the region's magnetic field weakened abruptly. At the same time, drought and windstorms devastated Mesopotamia, erasing crops and driving people north. The Sumerians called it the year when the wind devoured the sky. Their texts do not describe chaos or war, but silence. The voice of the deep was lost. The rivers ceased to speak. The collapse of climate was, to them, the death of communication between heaven and earth. We too live under such silence. Our instruments measure environmental change in data and graphs. Yet beneath the analysis is a familiar dread, that we're again out of tune with the planet that sustains us. The Sumerians would have recognized the feeling, the unease that comes when harmony turns to noise, when the sky no longer matches the measure of the ground. In a sense, our technology is a mirror of their temples. Their ziggurats channeled the hum of the earth. Our cities hum with electromagnetic energy of our own making. But the difference is intent. They sought resonance. We seek extraction. They listened. We drown the sound. And so, the balance drifts again. One tablet from the twilight of Sumer, half broken and covered in soot, carries a single line that reads almost like a warning. When the hum of men becomes louder than the hum of the earth, the deep will turn its face away. It is difficult not to hear in that line a whisper to the future, to us. Perhaps the ancients were not worshipping gods but maintaining equilibrium, acting as caretakers of the great frequency that holds the world together. When that duty was forgotten, the floods came, not as punishment, but as correction. And yet, even within collapse, they believed in renewal. The same texts that mourn the silence also predict a return. When the deep stirs once more, when the clay trembles with the first note, the world will rise again. The archaeologists who unearthed the last archive of Ur found something curious among the shattered tablets. A clay figurine of a musician, seated cross-legged, holding a small lyre. The strings were gone, but the fingers still pressed invisible chords. On its base, one word remained, gish nigin, to repeat. It is the simplest of Sumerian verbs, but also one of the most profound. To repeat, to restore, to remember. History itself is a repetition, a resonance that never dies but changes frequency. The Sumerians may be gone, but their vibration continues. Through our architecture, our numbers, our languages, our science, our longing for the infinite. We are their echo, still singing the same song in different forms. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the machines fall silent and the world seems to pause, you can almost feel it. That low, patient hum rising from the ground, threading through air and blood alike. The same pulse that once shook the temples of Ur still vibrates beneath our feet, waiting to be recognized. Maybe it's not the past calling us, but the deep reminding us that nothing truly vanishes. Every frequency returns, every silence hides a song, and if the earth hums louder before it rains, perhaps history hums louder before it remembers. At night, the Tigris moves like ink, slow, reflective, silent, except for the sound of water brushing ancient stones. Along its banks lie the ruins of Kish, Nippur, Lagash, and Ur, their outlines softened by millennia of wind. From above, they appear as faint spirals and squares, ghostly geometry pressed into the earth, almost invisible until light shifts at dawn. Archaeologists once called these the fingerprints of civilization, but perhaps they are more than that. Perhaps they are the score of a forgotten music. For across all Sumer's cities the patterns repeat. Circular foundations, radial streets, temple stairways set at precise angles, canals aligned to solstice sunrise. The same ratios recur like musical intervals. One measure governs all, the constant of proportion between structure and shadow. Even the rivers themselves, when charted, seem to curve in harmonic progression, as though the builders had traced their cities on the resonance of the land. Could it be that the earlier city planners were also composers, designing their world as a song made visible? Some scholars think so. In 2022, satellite imaging revealed that when Sumerian city grids were overlaid onto harmonic waveforms, their proportions matched the nodes of standing sound waves. Each temple marked a point of resonance. The entire Mesopotamian plain, it seemed, had been tuned like an instrument. The cities were chords, the ziggurats, amplifiers. Civilization itself, a composition. If that is true, then humanity's first cities were not built against nature, but with it, attempts to give structure to the Earth's own vibration. And when those cities fell, the song went underground. The Sumerians spoke of the halls of clay, a subterranean realm where all words eventually returned, the underworld of archives. Archaeologists interpret this as mythic imagery for tombs, but one unearthed site near modern Assyria challenges that view. Beneath a collapsed canal, they found a labyrinth of clay-lined tunnels extending for hundreds of meters. The walls bore no decoration, but the tunnels curved in rhythmic arcs, like acoustic chambers. Within one, they found hundreds of small tablets sealed in bitumen, untouched since antiquity. Most were blank, their surfaces smoothed but never inscribed, as if waiting to receive a voice. The excavators called it the library that never spoke. Yet perhaps it did speak once. Perhaps these empty tablets were not meant for writing, but for sound, their shape optimized to resonate at specific frequencies, storing vibration rather than language, a material memory far older than our concept of text. To the Sumerians, writing was sound made solid, thought transformed into vibration trapped in clay. The reed stylus was not only a tool but an instrument, the word for it, jidu, meaning both to inscribe and to play. Lul. When the scribe pressed the wedge, he was not only recording speech but recreating its rhythm, the same rhythm the gods used to speak the world into being. Modern physics would later call this principle information theory, matter as encoded vibration. But 5,000 years earlier, the Sumerians were already enacting it in ritual and record. Their legacy persists in every act of writing we perform. Every word typed or spoken is still an attempt to preserve vibration, to keep the clay alive. We do not realize how ancient this impulse is, to translate breath into permanence, to hold the vanishing in form. Perhaps that is what they meant by me, the divine decrees of civilization. The me were not commandments, they were patterns, laws of resonance governing everything from music to morality. To restore the me was to bring harmony back to the world. And maybe that is what our time has forgotten. We still build towers and systems, but we have lost the tuning fork. The hum of creation has faded beneath the noise of progress. When the ancients said that the gods withdrew into the deep, they may have meant that the frequency fell beyond human range, inaudible, but not gone. Every temple that crumbled, every archive that vanished was merely an instrument left unplayed. The music still exists, but we have lost the ear to hear it. Perhaps that is why the ruins draw us. When we walk among the fractured stones of Ur or the shattered steps of Eridu, something within us vibrates in recognition. Not memory exactly, more like resonance. The body remembers what the mind cannot. The pattern of harmony once felt when humanity and the world sang the same song. In one of the last surviving Sumerian laments written as their empire fell, a voice speaks to the ruins. The walls no longer echo, the gates no longer sing, but the foundation still hums beneath the dust. That single line, the foundation still hums, may be the truest statement of civilization ever written. Every culture since has built upon those foundations, each adding its own octave to the song. The Egyptians sang it in stone, the Greeks turned it to mathematics, the Renaissance echoed it in art. We, in our own strange way, encode it in data and signal, but the melody is the same, the endless human attempt to give form to vibration, to make permanence out of sound. And so, Sumer lives on, not as ruins, but as rhythm. Even now, the cosmic background hum, the residual vibration of creation itself, still resonates through everything we build, everything we are. The ancients called it the voice of Enki, the breath of the deep. We call it gravity, resonance, waveform, frequency. But the names don't matter. The song is the same. Perhaps that is the secret that connects them to us. We are still trying to tune the world. We build machines to listen to the stars, satellites to measure cosmic echoes, telescopes that peer into time. All of it in its essence is the same act the Sumerian scribe performed when he pressed a reed into clay, a gesture toward the infinite, a quiet attempt to remember. In the stillness between ages when civilizations collapse and silence returns, that gesture remains. The deep waits, the tone persists, the foundations still hum. And maybe that hum is not memory, but promise. The assurance that no matter how many times the world forgets, the song of the first civilization will rise again, each time in a new form, each time closer to harmony. Because sound does not die. It only changes medium. When the last light fades over the plain of southern Iraq, the horizon turns the colour of ash and copper. The wind drifts through the reeds along the Euphrates, carrying the same sound it has carried for 5,000 years, that faint, unbroken sigh of water and dust. Somewhere beneath that surface, beneath meters of silt and forgotten layers of time, lie the fragments of tablets still unread, still whispering. And if you listen long enough, it begins to feel as if the earth itself is exhaling words older than memory. Perhaps this is where the story has always led, back to the silence after the flood, to the first hand pressing the first sign into clay, to the sound before language. All that has survived of Sumer is fragment, yet each fragment vibrates with the same intent, to preserve what cannot be held. Every wedge, every symbol, every chant was a bridge across oblivion. The ancients knew what we are only beginning to rediscover, that memory is not a library but a resonance. To remember is to participate in the vibration that sustains the world. Their myths, once dismissed as superstition, now read like coded physics. The flood was entropy, the gods, harmonics, the me, universal laws. The temples were instruments, the cities frequencies, the people themselves notes in a cosmic chord. To forget was to fall out of tune, to lose alignment with the deep. And when the final Sumerian scribe laid down his stylus, that chord dissolved into centuries of static. The knowledge sank into silence, carried in fragments through Akkad, Babylon, Greece and Rome, through faith and empire, through destruction and rediscovery. Yet the vibration never died. It hid itself in geometry, in mathematics, in proportion, in the rhythm of breath. It became the architecture of cathedrals, the intervals of music, the equations of science. We call these progress, but they are really echoes, the deep remembering itself through us. When the James Webb Space Telescope looked across 13 billion years and captured the light of the first galaxies, what it found was not chaos but pattern, symmetry, rhythm, proportion. In that light, we are staring at the same truth the Sumerians once felt beneath their feet, that the universe moves according to measure. The gods were never outside us. They were the order within the storm, and yet, for all our precision, we remain haunted by the same silence they feared, the hum that fades, the measure that slips. We build machines to capture it, but we do not listen as they did. We analyze, categorize, dissect. We forget that knowledge is also reverence. The Sumerians knelt before their instruments because they heard in them the breath of creation. We call that myth. But maybe it was humility, an understanding that awareness itself is sacred. When the ancients said that writing was the song of the clay, they meant that consciousness and matter were not separate. Each tablet was a living frequency, carrying the echo of its maker's breath. Today, our data centers hum with billions of invisible frequencies, a new clay, storing our voices, our stories, our dreams. The medium has changed, but the act is the same. We are still pressing marks into the fabric of the world, hoping they will endure the next flood. In that way, humanity is the deep's experiment in memory, a species made to remember the sound of creation. The Sumerians believed the deep had two currents, one descending, one rising. The descending current was knowledge falling into matter, the rising, awareness returning to its source. To live was to oscillate between them, to carry the vibration upward. The The true task of civilization was not to dominate nature, but to harmonize with it, to keep the frequencies aligned so the song could continue. They failed. So did we, and perhaps we always will. But failure too is part of the rhythm. Each collapse makes room for the next note. Each silence prepares the next voice. If Sumer was the first verse of humanity, then we are perhaps the bridge, the echo carrying that first sound into another octave. Our instruments are more complex, but our longing is the same. To reach across the abyss, to find pattern in the noise, to prove that the universe remembers us. There is a passage in the Lament for Nippur that reads, "The river has changed its bed, yet the sound remains." It was written 4,000 years ago, but it could have been written now. The river changes, time, language, empire, medium, yet the sound remains. That is all civilization ever achieves, the continuation of tone. And perhaps that is enough, because when the archaeologists brush the dust from another tablet, when the satellites capture the hum of another distant star, when a child hears music and feels for the first time that trembling of recognition, the same vibration passes through them that once moved through the temples of Sumer. The song has never stopped. It has only changed form. We are still part of it, the listeners and the instruments both. And one day, when the winds shift again and the deep begins to stir, another civilization will rise from the clay. They will build new temples, new archives, new languages. They will rediscover the hum beneath their feet and call it by another name. And when they do, perhaps they will find our remnants, our tablets of glass and code, and hear faintly the same note we inherited from Sumer. Then the deep will remember itself once more, and the world for a moment will be in tune again, until silence returns, not as an ending, but as breath before another beginning.